Welcome to Soft Mystic Stories. There is a particular kind of darkness that belongs to Britain, alone. It is not the darkness of jungles or deserts or open plains. It is older than those. It is the darkness of wet stone and ancient wood of moors, stretching out past the edge of what any map has ever properly captured of coastlines, where the sea comes in grey and low and indifferent, and swallows whatever it wants without explanation. It is the darkness of a country that has been inhabited for so long by so many different peoples, through so many layers of conquest and memory and loss, that the ground itself seems to carry the weight of things that were never fully resolved. Britain is a small island. It is easy to forget that when you look at how much history it contains. You can drive from one end of England to another in under 6 hours. You can cross Scotland in a day, and yet within that comparatively modest geography, there are mysteries that have baffled scholars, detectives, scientists, and ordinary people for centuries. Some of them are centuries old. Some of them are barely 50 years in the past. Some of them have explanations that almost fit, but leave something uncomfortable still sitting at the edge of the answer, something that refuses to be resolved. Tonight, we are going to move through some of those mysteries together. The format is simple. You are going to settle in. You are going to let the sound of this voice carry you through the fog and the cold and the long corridors of British history. We are not going to rush. There is no urgency here. These things happened a long time ago, and they will still be unresolved at the end of this, and that is all right. Part of the pleasure is sitting with the not knowing. Part of the pleasure is letting the questions wash over you, and observing how they feel rather than demanding they produce answers. Britain gave the world Sherlock Holmes, which is interesting, a country so fascinated by mystery that it invented the greatest fictional detective ever written, a country so full of unresolved cases that it needed an imaginary genius to provide the satisfactions that real life refused to deliver. And yet even Sherlock Holmes never cracked the cases we are going to discuss tonight, because these are real, and real mysteries have a texture that fiction cannot fully replicate. They have gaps that were never filled. They have witnesses who died before they could be interviewed properly. They have evidence that was lost or destroyed, or never collected in the first place. They have the particular unsatisfying quality of truth, which is that it does not always resolve itself into a clean ending. The wind over Dartmoor does not care about your theories. The fog on the Thames does not part to reveal hidden answers. The stones of the Tower of London have absorbed several hundred years of screaming and silence, in roughly equal measure, and they are not giving anything back. So settle in. Close your eyes if you like. Let your breathing slow. We are going in. And Britain, as it always has been, is waiting. Before we go further, if you are the kind of person who finds yourself drawn to history's unanswered questions, to the places where the record goes dark and the explanations run out, then this is your corner of the internet. Leave a comment below and tell me which mystery keeps you up at night. Not metaphorically, literally, the one you think about before you sleep. Tell me where you are listening from. I read every single one, and if you are new here, consider staying. We do this kind of thing a lot. Now, into the dark. The Tower and the disappeared princes. In the summer of 1483, 2 boys went into the Tower of London and were never seen again. That sentence on its own is enough. It contains within it one of the most debated and unresolved mysteries in all of British dark history. A mystery that has produced more books, more arguments, more theories, and more passionate disagreement than almost any other question about the medieval period. It has made enemies of historians. It has divided Shakespeare scholars. It has launched entire organizations dedicated to its resolution. And after more than 500 years, we still do not know exactly what happened to Edward Lviv and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York. Let us go back to the beginning, because the beginning matters. Edward IV of England died on the 9th of April 1483. He was not particularly old. He was 40 years old, and had been king for most of his adult life. And his death was unexpected enough that it created an immediate crisis. His son and heir, also named Edward, was 12 years old and living at Lello Castle in Shropshire when his father died. The boy was proclaimed Edward IV almost immediately, but a 12-year-old king is a king in name only. Somebody had to hold the actual power, and the question of who that would be was going to cause tremendous suffering over the following months. The obvious candidates were the young king's maternal family, the Woodvilles, who were numerous and well-connected, and had been growing in influence throughout Edward the Thor's reign. Queen Elizabeth Woodville had brothers, nephews, cousins, all placed in positions of influence across the kingdom, and they moved quickly after the old king's death to secure their position. The young Edward the Fire's escort from Lello to London was accompanied by a significant Woodville force, but there was another candidate for the role of Lord Protector, which was the formal position that would govern the kingdom during the king's minority. That candidate was Richard, Duke of Gloucester, Edward the Thor's younger brother, the young king's uncle. Richard intercepted the royal party at Stony Stratford in late April of 1483. He had been moving south from York with his own forces. He met the young king. He was courteous and respectful by all accounts, and then he arrested the Woodville lords, who were accompanying Edward, and took control of the king himself. The Woodvilles scrambled. Queen Elizabeth took her younger children, including her son, Richard, Duke of York, into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey. She had done this once before, during the conflicts of Edward I's reign, and she knew how it worked. Richard of Gloucester took the young Edward V to London and installed him in the Tower of London. This was not at the time the sinister act it would later seem. The Tower was a royal residence. Kings often stayed there in the period before their coronation. Edward V's coronation was planned for the 24th of June 1483. Everything was moving toward that date. And then things began to go wrong very quickly. In June of 1483, Richard's supporters put forward the claim that Edward the Thor's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid. The grounds were complicated and contested, but the essential argument was that Edward the Thor had been previously contracted to another woman before his marriage to Elizabeth, and that this pre-contract invalidated the marriage and made all its children illegitimate. If the young Edward V was a bastard, he could not be king. Parliament accepted this argument, which was formalized in an act called Titulus Regius, and on the 26th of June 1483, Richard of Gloucester accepted the throne of England as Richard III. The young Edward V was joined in the Tower by his brother Richard, Duke of York, who had been persuaded out of sanctuary in Westminster in mid-June, the exact circumstances of which remain disputed. From that point onward, the boys were seen less and less frequently. There were reports of them playing in the Tower grounds in the early summer of 1483. A physician named John Argentine, who attended the young Edward, reported that the boy seemed despairing going to confession every day, as if he believed he was about to die. Argentine's account was recorded by a man named Dominic Mancini, an Italian visitor to England, who was gathering information for his employer, and who left England shortly after Richard III's coronation. After the summer of 1483, there are no reliable contemporary accounts of anyone seeing the boys at all. The silence is the thing, the absence is the thing. In September of 1483, a rebellion against Richard III was already forming, organized partly around men who had previously been loyal to Edward IV. One explanation for this, suggested by the contemporary sources, is that by September 1483 it was widely believed, at least among those who would have had some way of knowing, that the boys were dead. Richard III was killed at the Battle of Bosworth in August 1485, and Henry VIII took the throne. Henry VIII, who had just as many reasons as anyone to want the question of the princes resolved, never officially announced that they were dead, and never charged Richard III with their murder. This is strange. If Henry had proof, or even credible evidence that Richard had murdered his nephews, the propaganda value of that charge would have been enormous. He did not make it. Henry eventually charged Richard in general terms with the deaths of Edward de Vere and his children, but he was notably vague. This vagueness has fueled centuries of argument. In 1674, workers renovating a staircase in the Tower of London found a wooden box containing the bones of 2 children. Charles Litt ordered them examined, concluded they were probably the princes, and had them rearrayed with ceremony in Westminster Abbey, where they remain today. In 1933, The bones were examined again by an expert named Lawrence Tanner and a physician named William Wright. They concluded, based on the age of the bones and other factors, that they were consistent with being the remains of Edward Thive and Richard of York. The problem is that the bones have never been subjected to DNA analysis. They have been requested for examination multiple times by historians and scientists. The answer has always been no. The Church of England and the Crown have authority over the burial site, and permission has not been granted. Whether that reluctance itself means anything is another question that does not have a clean answer. The suspects are by now well established in the historical literature. Richard III is the traditional villain, and for centuries was essentially the accepted murderer. Shakespeare made him the definitive answer, gave him the hunchback, the scheming monologues, the hired assassins. The Ricardians, an organization dedicated to rehabilitating Richard III's reputation, have spent decades arguing that the evidence against him is circumstantial, that he had reasons not to kill his nephews, and that there are other suspects. Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, was Richard III's closest ally in the seizure of power in 1483. He also turned against Richard later in the same year and led the rebellion mentioned above. Some historians have suggested that Buckingham may have ordered the murders without Richard's knowledge or permission, possibly as a way of removing the boys as potential rallying points for opposition, or possibly for his own reasons. This theory has the advantage of explaining why Richard III never publicly acknowledged the deaths, and why he did not simply display the boys to prove they were alive. Henry VIII himself has been suggested, though the timeline makes this difficult. Henry did not arrive in England until August 1485, and most evidence suggests the boys disappeared in 1483. Unless they survived until 1485 in secret, Henry could not have killed them. Margaret Beaufort, Henry VII's mother, has been suggested by some historians as a possible orchestrator, though the evidence for this is thin. There is even a theory, sometimes called the survival theory, that the boys were not killed at all, that one or both were smuggled out of the country and lived their lives elsewhere. Perkin Warbeck, who appeared in the 1490s claiming to be Richard, Duke of York, was taken seriously enough by several European monarchs that he was received at their courts and married a Scottish noblewoman. Henry VIII eventually captured and executed him in 1499, but not before Warbeck had caused significant disruption. Whether he was genuine or an impostor, and if an impostor who trained him, remains unresolved. The Tower of London stands today, and you can visit it. You can walk the grounds where children played in the summer of 1483. You can look at the stone walls that closed around them. You can visit Westminster Abbey and stand near where bones that might be theirs lie in a small urn, in a corner of the Henry VIII Lady Chapel. But the bones have never been tested. The question has never been answered. 500 years of argument and scholarship and passion and ink, and the most fundamental question, what happened to those two boys, cannot be answered with certainty. That is what a real mystery looks like. The Green Children of Woolpit. In the village of Woolpit, in the county of Suffolk, sometime in the 12th century, two children emerged from a pit in the ground. This is already unusual. But what made the people of Woolpit stop and stare? What made them call their neighbors and stand in puzzled groups around the edge of that harvesting pit in the fields was this. The children's skin was green, not slightly green, not a greenish tinge that might be attributed to illness or the light. Green, distinctly, unmistakably green. Their clothing was strange, made from a material that no one recognized. They were frightened and disoriented, and they would not eat anything that was placed before them. They spoke a language that nobody in Woolpit could identify when people tried to communicate with them in English or French, or the fragments of other languages that a Suffolk village in the 12th century might have had access to. The children simply stared. They were taken in by a local landowner, in some accounts identified as a man named Richard Dall, and cared for over the following weeks and months. During this time, the girl eventually began to eat, and over time her skin lost its green color. The boy, who was sickly from the beginning, died after a relatively short time. The girl survived, learned English, was eventually baptized, and according to the accounts, became, as one chronicler put it, rather free in her behavior. She told a story. The story she told, as recorded by two 12th-century writers named William of Newburgh and Ralph of Coggeshall, was this. She and her brother came from a land where there was no sun. The light in their land was always twilight, always dim. The quality of light after sunset, but before full dark. The people there were green. She did not know how they had come to be in Woolpit. She remembered following the sound of bells through a cave or passage, and then she was in the harvesting pit in the field, and the sky above her was far brighter than any sky she had ever seen, and everything was wrong. She mentioned a river that separated their land from another land, where the light was brighter. She could not explain more than that. She did not know where her home was in relation to Woolpit. She did not know how to get back. This story has been told and retold and analyzed for 900 years, and it remains genuinely strange, regardless of which explanatory framework you bring to it. The skeptical explanations begin with a condition called hypochromic anemia, sometimes called green sickness in historical sources, which can give the skin a faintly greenish hue due to iron deficiency. This is a real condition, and it is plausible that malnourished children might exhibit it. The problem is that contemporaries who saw the children described the coloration as clearly and distinctly green, not the faint pallor of anemia. William of Newburgh was a careful chronicler, not given to wild embellishment. When he said green, he presumably meant something more striking than a pale complexion. Some historians have proposed that the children were Flemish immigrants, possibly children of a Flemish community somewhere in the region who became lost. There were Flemish immigrants in England during the 12th century, some of whom faced hostility and displacement during the civil conflicts of the period known as the Anarchy. Children from such a community might speak an unfamiliar language, might be dressed strangely, might be disoriented and frightened. The green skin remains unexplained by this theory. The underground land, the perpetual twilight, the river, the cave or passage through which they came. These details suggest to some researchers a possible connection to ancient folklore. Traditions about an underground realm, sometimes identified with fairy belief, sometimes with older traditions that predate Christianity in Britain. The idea of a land beneath the earth, inhabited by beings who are like humans, but different, is not specific to Suffolk. It appears across European and Celtic traditions in various forms, but this does not explain what actually happened to those children. There is a theory advanced more recently that connects the children to the Babes in the Wood story, a folk tale associated with Wayland Wood in Norfolk, not far from Woolpit. In the Babes in the Wood story, two children are abandoned in a forest and die there. Some researchers have suggested a historical kernel to that story, possibly connected to the Woolpit children, possibly not. The connection is suggestive, but not provable. There is also the straightforward question of why William of Newburgh included this story in his chronicle at all. William was a serious historian. His chronicle covers important political and ecclesiastical events of the 12th century. He did not include fantastic tales indiscriminately. He prefaced his account of the Green Children with a note that this was a remarkable and undoubted event, remarkable enough that he felt obliged to record it, even if he could not explain it. He says that it was widely witnessed, that many people in the area could vouch for it. He does not say the children were demons, or fairies, or supernatural in origin. He says they were green, and they came from underground, and he did not know what to make of it. Ralph of Coggeshall's account is independent of William's. They use different sources that two separate medieval chroniclers, working independently, recorded the same basic story, gives it at least some claim to being based on a real event. Whatever that event was, what is certain is that this happened in some form in 12th century Suffolk, something unusual enough that it was recorded and remembered. Children who were different enough to be remarked upon by serious chroniclers, a girl who survived and told a story that nobody knew what to do with. The village of Woolpit still exists. It still has its wolf pits, the harvesting pits from which it takes its name. The Church of St. Mary the Virgin in Woolpit has, for as long as anyone can remember, had a small image of a green child worked into its decor. The village has not forgotten, Whatever came out of that pit on a day in the 12th century, the memory of it has outlasted almost everything else from that time. The names of the lords and ladies of Suffolk from 1150 are gone from most people's consciousness. The specific political events of the period are known only to specialists, but the Green Children of Woolpit are still here, still being discussed, still unresolved. Some things refuse to stay buried. The Whitechapel murders, and the man who was never found in the autumn of 1888. Somebody was killing women in the East End of London, and the police could not find them. This is a sentence that has been written in some form or another more times than anyone could possibly count. The Whitechapel murders, the canonical 5 attributed to the killer who called himself Jack the Ripper, are probably the most famous unsolved murders in human history. They have generated more books, more films, more theories, more amateur investigations, more professional disagreements, and more sheer accumulated obsession than any other criminal case from any century. The name Ripper has become a brand, a shorthand, a cultural reference so ubiquitous that it sometimes obscures the fact that 5 real women died in terrible circumstances, in a very specific place, at a very specific time, and nobody has ever been held accountable. The East End of London in 1888 is worth understanding as a place before we understand what happened for there. Whitechapel and Spitalfields and the surrounding areas were among the most densely populated and impoverished urban environments in the world. The Industrial Revolution had drawn hundreds of thousands of people into London from across Britain and beyond, and many of them had ended up in the East End, piled into tenement buildings, working in sweatshops, living on wages that could not support a stable life. There were significant immigrant communities, including a large Jewish population, that had fled persecution in Eastern Europe. There were doss houses where you could sleep in a bed for a few pennies, and if you did not have a few pennies, you might sleep on a rope strung between 2 walls for a penny, leaning over it like laundry. And if you did not have that penny, you were in the street. The women who were killed were part of this world. They have often been referred to in historical and popular accounts in ways that reduced their humanity and emphasized their status as prostitutes, but recent scholarship has pushed back on this framing. Their lives were complicated. Some of them did occasionally sell sex when they had no other way to eat or pay for a bed. All of them were caught in economic circumstances that offered very few good options. They deserve to be named. Mary Ann Nichols, known as Polly, was 43 years old. She was found in the early hours of the 31st of August, 1888, in Bucks Row, Whitechapel, her throat cut deeply twice, and her abdomen mutilated. Annie Chapman was 47. She was found on the 8th of September, in the backyard of a lodging house at 29 Hamry Street. Her throat cut, her abdomen opened, her uterus removed. Elizabeth Stride was 44, a Swedish immigrant. She was found on the 30th of September in Dutfield's yard, off Burner Street, her throat cut, but with none of the abdominal mutilation of the earlier victims. On the same night, less than an hour later, and less than a mile away, Catherine Edos was found in Mitre Square, in the City of London, her throat cut, her face mutilated, her kidney removed. Mary Jane Kelly was 25, the youngest of the 5. And she was found on the 9th of November in her own room at 13 Miller's Court, having been killed with an intensity that exceeded all the others. She had lived there long enough to have decorated the walls with newspaper clippings. The murders caused a sensation that went far beyond London. Letters came to the police from across the world. Theories proliferated. The word Ripper entered the public consciousness through a letter that may or may not have been written by the actual killer. A letter received by a news agency in late September 1888, signed Jack the Ripper, written in a mocking tone, promising more murders. There is serious scholarly debate about whether this letter was genuine or a hoax perpetrated by a journalist. The name stuck regardless. The investigation was conducted by the Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police, the latter having jurisdiction over the Eddowes murder because of its location. They were hampered by several things. The nature of the neighborhood with its dense maze of streets and courts and alleys made effective policing extremely difficult. The residents of the East End were not always cooperative with police. for reasons that had everything to do with class and power and lived experience. And the detective methods of 1888 were simply not what they would later become. There was no fingerprint analysis. There was no forensic science in the modern sense. There was eyewitness testimony. There was the physical evidence of bodies and scenes. And there was careful investigation. The police did make progress. They developed suspects. One of the most significant pieces of evidence was a description given by Elizabeth Long, who said she saw Annie Chapman talking to a man outside 29 Hanbury Street shortly before her body was whipped. The man, she said, was dark, foreign-looking, over 40, and wearing a deerstalker hat. This description did not match all of the later suspects that have been proposed. The suspects are legion. They have been proposed by serious scholars, by journalists, by amateur investigators, by novelists, by documentary filmmakers, by people who found a letter in an attic or a diary in a pawnshop, or who became convinced, through a chain of reasoning, that they had solved it. The most credible suspects from a scholarly perspective include Aaron Kosminski, a Polish, Jewish immigrant, who was named in a memorandum by Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, and who was identified by a senior police official named Melville Macton as one of 3 main suspects. Kosminski was committed to an asylum in 1891 and died there. There is a piece of evidence, a shawl allegedly found at the Edouard's crime scene, that was the subject of DNA analysis published in 2014, which purported to connect both Eidos and Kosminski to the shore. The methodology of that analysis was challenged by other scientists, and the question of the Shaw's chain of custody has been disputed. It remains contested. Francis Tumblety, an American quack doctor who was arrested in London in November 1888 on other charges and fled to America before he could be questioned further, has been proposed by some researchers. John Druitt, a barrister who drowned himself in the Thames in December 1888, was named by Macton as the most likely suspect. Walter Sickert, the painter, was dramatically proposed by crime novelist Patricia Cornwall in a book that cost her millions of dollars of her own money to research, and that was received skeptically by most Ripper scholars. Prince Albert Victor, Queen Victoria's grandson, has been proposed as part of various conspiracy theories that have generally been dismissed by serious researchers. The Ripper letters are their own sub-mystery. Several hundred letters were received by the police and press purporting to be from the killer. Most were obviously hoaxes, the productions of people seeking attention or seeking to mislead the investigation. The From Hell letter received by the head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee in October 1888 and accompanied by half of a preserved human kidney that may or may not have belonged to Catherine Editos is considered by some researchers the most likely to be genuine. Its tone is different from the other letters, more direct, less theatrical. The kidney was examined by a physician who concluded that it appeared to be a woman's kidney, and that the other half of it showed signs of Britt's disease, a condition that Catherine Editos was known to have suffered from. But the kidney could not be definitively connected to Editos. The letter could not be definitively attributed to the killer. Nothing could be definitively connected to anyone. The murders stopped after the 9th of November 1888, after Mary Jane Kelly. Nobody knows why. Did the killer die? Did he leave London? Did he stop? Was he identified and quietly removed from circulation, through commitment, or transportation, or private means? The stopping of the murders is as much a mystery as the murders themselves. The streets of Whitechapel still exist in modified form. You can walk them. Jack the Ripper tours have become a significant part of London's tourism industry, which has generated its own ethical debate about the commodification of the murders of 5 vulnerable women. The questions raised by those debates are real and worth sitting with, but the mystery remains. In the autumn of 1888, somebody killed 5 women in a small area of East London, and after more than 130 years of investigation, theorizing, argumentation, DNA analysis, document excavation, and sheer accumulated obsession, we do not know who it was. The night those women walked through, the streets those women knew, The killer those streets concealed. All of it is still, in the most important sense, dark. The lighthouse at the edge of the world. On the 15th of December 1900, a supply ship called the Hesperus arrived at the Flannan Isles, a small group of uninhabited islands about 20 miles west of the Isle of Lewis, in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland. The 3 lighthouse keepers who were stationed on the main island, Island Moor, were gone. Their names were James Ducat, who was 40 years old, and the principal keeper, Thomas Marshall, who was 28, and Donald MacArthur, who was 40. They had been stationed there since the lighthouse opened in 1899, rotating shifts with a 4th keeper. They were experienced men. They had been doing this work for years, and they were gone. The Hesperus was delayed in reaching the islands because of bad weather, which is why the visit was 15 days after its scheduled date of the 30th of November. When the ship arrived, nobody came to meet it at the landing. The lighthouse was not manned. The signal lantern had gone out. The relief keeper on the Hesperus, a man named Joseph Moore, was rowed ashore. What Moore found when he reached the lighthouse station was a set of details that have been puzzled over ever since. The main lighthouse structure was locked and in good order. The light mechanism had been wound down as if properly maintained. The beds were made. Inside the kitchen, the table was laid for a meal, but the meal had not been eaten. A clock on the wall had stopped. The logbook was in order up to the 13th of December, 2 days before the Hesperides arrived, though a later examination would establish that the log had not been fully updated, and that entries for subsequent days might have been lost with the men. 2 of the 3 sets of oilskins, the waterproof outer garments worn when working outside in bad weather, were gone from their hooks. The 3rd set of oilskins, belonging to MacArthur, was still hanging there. This detail has attracted particular attention because MacArthur was the most experienced outdoorsman of the 3, and because going outside in the storms that battered the Flannan Isles without oilskins was something an experienced keeper would not normally do. Outside there was evidence of storm damage. The west landing, a concrete platform used for loading supplies, had been damaged significantly. A metal box of mooring ropes had been moved from its secured position. Railings had been bent. The stone steps leading to the platform had been damaged. These were significant impacts, the marks of a storm severe enough to move heavy objects. The commissioners of northern lighthouses launched an inquiry. The inquiry concluded essentially that the most likely explanation was that 2 of the men had gone to the west landing to check on storm damage or secure equipment, that an unexpected wave had swept them off, that MacArthur had gone out without his oilskins when he saw this happen, and that all 3 had been swept away. This explanation is logical. It is consistent with most of the evidence. It has the endorsement of the official inquiry, and it leaves enough unanswered that it has never quite satisfied everyone who has looked at the case carefully. The unanswered questions accumulate if you push on them. Why would 2 men go to a landing that was known to be dangerous in storm conditions? Why is there no record in the log of the kind of anxiety or premonition that you might expect from men aware of that danger? Thomas Marshall's log entries from the days before the disappearance mentioned rough weather and noted that Ducat and MacArthur were quiet and praying, which is striking and which suggests a level of fear or unease that was unusual for these experienced men. But whether that unease was caused by the weather conditions they were observing or by something else is not knowable. The uneaten meal is the detail that sticks most persistently. A table laid for a meal that was never eaten suggests that whatever happened quickly, that the men did not finish eating before something demanded their attention. The inference is that something urgent, something requiring immediate action, interrupted their meal. A wave, visible from the window, sounds from outside, some emergency. But there is another version of the uneaten meal that is less clean. If one man went outside first, and then something happened to him, and then a second man went to help, and then the third, you would also get an uneaten meal. You would also get 2 sets of oilskins taken, and 1 left behind. The order of events does not have to be simultaneous. A poet named Wilfred Wilson Gibson wrote a ballad about the Flannan Isles mystery in 1912, 12 years after the disappearance, and introduced into the popular imagination several details that have no basis in the actual investigation. He invented a log entry describing a strange figure, a supernatural presence. He invented ghostly lights and an atmosphere of dread. None of this is in the real documents, but the poem became so well known that some of its inventions entered accounts of the case as if they were fact, which is itself a lesson in how quickly myth accumulates around a genuine mystery. The Flannan Isles themselves are still there. The lighthouse was automated in 1971 and still operates. The islands are occasionally visited by researchers and wildlife observers because they have a significant seabird population. The atmosphere, by all accounts, is remote and strange in the way that very isolated places have. The wind comes off the Atlantic without interruption for thousands of miles. The light changes the way it does in northern latitudes, where the sun moves low and slow across the sky. What happened on the 13th of December 1900 to 3 experienced lighthouse keepers on a tiny island in the middle of the North Atlantic? The official inquiry could not definitively establish. The most probable answer is a wave. A terrible accident in terrible conditions. 3 men in the wrong place at the wrong moment, swept away before anyone could do anything. This is the kind of thing that the sea does. It does it with complete indifference to the records and explanations that will be demanded afterward. But the meal on the table, the missing oilskins, the damaged landing, the stopped clock, the final entries in the log describing men who were quiet and praying. The sea took whatever it knew with it. The Pendle Hill witches. In the spring of 1612, on the slopes of Pendle Hill in Lanarkshire, a chain of events began that would end with 20 people accused of witchcraft, and 10 of them hanged. The Pendle witch trials are the most documented and the largest witch trials in English pig history. They are also, when you look at them carefully, a story about poverty, family feuds, political pressure, and the terrifying vulnerability of people who had no power in a society that was actively looking for threats. Whether any of the people convicted had any connection to actual witchcraft in the sense of genuinely supernatural practices is a question most serious historians do not spend much time on. The more pressing question is what actually happened on Pendle Hill in 1612, who these people were, why they were accused, and why the machinery of the law moved with such speed and force against them. Pendle Hill rises 919 feet above the Lancashire countryside. In 1612, the area around it was a landscape of manned and small farming communities, economically marginal, isolated enough that it operated somewhat outside the direct supervision of the authorities in ways that more central areas of England did not. The people who lived there were mostly poor. Many of them were Catholic, in a period when Catholicism was officially suppressed, which made them automatically suspect in the eyes of the Protestant state. The memory of the gunpowder plot of 605, the attempted assassination of James A. Thurman, was only 7 years old, and the authorities were acutely conscious of Catholic threats, real and imagined. The events of 1612 began, as many cascading disasters do, with something small. Alison Device, a young woman from a family that was already known locally for alleged magical practices, encountered a peddler named John Law on a road near Cole in late March 1612. There was some kind of interaction between them, the exact nature of which is disputed by the sources, and shortly afterward, John Law collapsed and had what appears to have been a stroke. Alison Device, convinced that she had caused it through supernatural means, or perhaps simply frightened and seeking to plead the peddler's angry son, confessed that she had made the man fall lame through her powers. This confession was everything the local justice of the peace, a man named Roger Now, needed. Noel was ambitious. The investigation of witchcraft was a way to demonstrate loyalty to James Osts, who was genuinely obsessed with witchcraft and had written a book about it called Demonology before he became King of England. Finding witches was politically useful. Now began interviewing witnesses and accused. He brought in members of the Device family, including Alison's grandmother, Elizabeth Southerns, known as Old Demdike, and her rival, a woman named Anne Whittle, known as Old Chattox. Both women were elderly, impoverished, and locally notorious as cunning women, practitioners of folk magic and healing. Both confessed to various supernatural acts, The confessions were taken as evidence of genuine witchcraft. Both women were imprisoned. Then something extraordinary happened that expanded the case dramatically. Alison's younger brother, James Device, and their mother, Elizabeth Device, organized a gathering at Mayland Tower, the Device family home, on Good Friday, the 10th of April, 1612. Approximately 20 people came. The stated purpose of this gathering is unclear. Some accounts suggest it was to plan a rescue of old Demdike from Lancaster Castle where she was imprisoned. Others suggest it was simply a gathering for food and drink. James the Fenn's recent law against witchcraft had specifically prohibited gatherings of multiple witches, and when Roger Noel heard about the Malin Tower meeting, he treated it as a witches' Sabbath. Everyone who was known to have attended the Malin Tower meeting was now potentially liable to prosecution. The investigation expanded. More people were arrested. Most damagingly for the accused, a 9-year-old girl named Janet Device, Alison, and James's younger sister, gave testimony against her own family. Janet stood on a table in the courtroom so that she could be seen and named the people present at the Malkin Tower meeting. Her testimony was used against her mother, her brother, her sister. Elizabeth Device screamed at her daughter during the trial, called her a witch herself, broke down in ways that the presiding judge noted as evidence of guilt. James Device attempted to withdraw his confession and stated that he had confessed in terror. It made no difference. The trials took place at Lancaster Assizes in August 1612, before a judge named Sir Edward Brumley and a judge named Sir James Allam. 10 people were convicted and hanged on the 20th of August, 1612. They were Elizabeth Device, James Device, Alison Device, Anne Whittle, Anne Redden, Alice Nutter, John Bulcock, Jane Bulcock, Catherine Hewitt, and Isabel Roby. Old Demdike had died in prison before she could be tried. One woman, Margaret Pearson, was convicted, but sentenced to the pillory rather than death. Alice Nutter's presence among the convicted is the detail that most puzzles historians. All the others came from the very poorest margins of the community, from families with nothing and no social protection. Alice Nutter was a widow of some means, a woman who owned property, who had connections to gentry families. What she was doing at the Malkin Tower gathering, if she was there at all, and why she made no serious defense of herself at trial despite her resources, has never been satisfactorily explained. Some historians have suggested she may have been attending a Catholic Mass at Malkin Tower, which some researchers believe is what the gathering actually was, and that she could not defend herself without admitting to Catholic practice, which carried its own severe penalties. The Pendle witch trials did not end with the 1612 hangings. In 1634, a series of accusations were made against another group of people in the Pendle area, this time initiated by a boy named Edmund Robinson, who claimed to have witnessed a witches' gathering. 20 people were accused. They were examined by a committee, including the king's physician, who could find no evidence of the devil's marks supposedly associated with witchcraft. Several of the accused were sent to London for further examination. Edmund Robinson eventually confessed that he had invented the entire story. Most of the accused were eventually released, though some had died in prison during the process. The hill still stands. Pendle Hill is a walking destination now, popular with hikers. On Halloween, crowds walk up it, in something that mixes genuine historical memory with tourism and festivity. At the top on a clear day, you can see very far in every direction. Lancashire spreads out below you. The moorland and the green valleys, and the towns that have grown where small communities once stood. The families of the accused lived on that hill and in those valleys for generations. Some of the surnames survive in local records long after 1612. What the convictions and hangings did to those surviving family members, to the children who lost parents, to the parents who lost children, is not something the historical record captures well. The record captures the proceedings. It captures the judge's satisfaction at the outcome. It does not capture what the Device children did with the rest of their lives, or what the surviving members of those 20 accused families carried with them. The questions that the Pendle trials raise about justice and power, and the vulnerability of the poor poor and marginalized in the face of an apparatus that has decided to move against them, are not historical questions. They are present ones. That is one reason the story does not fade. The Rendlesham Forest incident on the night of the 26th of December 1980, and over the nights that followed, something happened in Rendlesham Forest in Suffolk that the United States Air Force could not explain, and which became the most discussed and contested UFO incident in British history. The context is important. Rendlesham Forest is a large area of coniferous woodland in Suffolk, not far from the North Sea coast. Adjacent to it at that time were two United States Air Force bases, RAF Bentwaters and REF Woodbridge, which were active NATO facilities during the Cold War. The bases were occupied by American military personnel and were considered sensitive installations. What they actually contained at the time has been the subject of considerable speculation, partly because it was later claimed that one or both of the bases were used to store nuclear weapons, which would have been significant in terms of the political and security context. On the night after Christmas 1980, just after midnight, security personnel at RAF Woodbridge observed unusual lights in the forest to the east of the base. The lights were reported as bright and moving. A security patrol was sent to investigate. What those men reported when they entered the forest, and what they wrote in official statements afterward, is this. They encountered a craft of some kind in a clearing. They described it as a metallic triangular object hovering above or resting near the ground, about 9 feet across and 6 or 7 feet high. It was lit with pulsing lights. It appeared to move away from them as they approached. Animals at a nearby farm reacted with distress throughout the incident. The deputy base commander at RAF Bentwaters was Lieutenant Colonel Charles Holt. Holt was a senior officer and a serious person by all accounts, not given to fantasy or exaggeration. Several nights after the initial incident on the 28th of December, Holt went into the forest himself with a team to investigate. He brought a dictaphone and recorded his observations in real time as they happened. The tape recording of Holt's investigation in the forest exists. It has been analyzed extensively. On it, you can hear Holt and his team observing lights in the sky that he describes as moving in ways that conventional aircraft do not move. You can hear him describing a beam of light that came down from above onto the ground near their position. You can hear him speaking with the careful, controlled tone of a man who is trying very hard to remain professional while experiencing something he cannot account for. In January 1981, Holt wrote a memorandum to the British Ministry of Defence describing the incidents. This document, which has become known as the Holt Memo, was declassified in 1983 under a Freedom of Information request in the United States. The memo is brief and factual in tone. It describes the lights, the landing marks found in the clearing, the radiation readings taken at those marks, the subsequent observations by Holt's own team. It concludes without offering an explanation. The radiation readings are a point of particular interest. The marks found in the clearing where the object was allegedly seen were measured for radiation, and readings were recorded that were, according to Holt's memo, significantly higher than background levels. Subsequent analysis of this claim has been disputed. Some researchers argue the readings were within normal variation for forest soil. Others argue they were anomalous. The explanations that have been offered for the Rendlesham incident range across a wide spectrum. The most prosaic explanation is the Orfordness Lighthouse, which sits on the Suffolk coast, and whose beam could be seen through the trees from within the forest. The lighthouse, this pattern of flashing could potentially account for some of the light observations. This explanation has been put forward seriously, and has been seriously contested by the witnesses who were familiar with the lighthouse beam, and who say that what they saw was clearly different. Ball lightning and other atmospheric plasma phenomena have been proposed. Experimental military aircraft possibly being tested from the bases have been proposed. Drug or alcohol intoxication, stress responses, and collective delusion have been proposed. The men who were there have rejected these explanations consistently over the more than 4 decades since the incident. Some witnesses over the years have made claims that go considerably beyond the initial, accounts and into territory that is much harder to assess. Claims of alien contact, of experiences that were edited from official accounts, of injuries and symptoms connected to radiation exposure, of being warned not to speak by intelligence officials. These claims are harder to evaluate because they emerge later and because the evidence for them is primarily the testimony of the witnesses themselves. What is not in dispute is that experienced military personnel reported extraordinary things in a Suffolk forest over multiple nights in December 1980, that a senior officer filed an official memorandum about those reports, that the memorandum was classified for 3 years, and that no official explanation was ever offered for what those personnel saw. The Ministry of Defence's response to the Holt memo was effectively to file it and move on. An internal review concluded that the reported events posed no threat to national security and required no further investigation. Whether this was a genuine assessment or a deliberate decision to not pursue something that nobody wanted to pursue is, like so many things about this case, a matter of interpretation. Rendlesham Forest is a public forest. You can walk in it. The clearing where the original incident allegedly occurred has been marked with a trail that takes visitors through the key locations. The clearing itself is a quiet, ordinary-look space in the trees. No marks, no residual evidence of anything, just trees and undergrowth, and the light filtering through the canopy. Charles Holt has given interviews over the years and has consistently maintained that what happened in that forest was real and was extraordinary and was never explained. He has called for a proper official investigation. No such investigation has been forthcoming. Whatever flew over Rendlesham Forest in December 1980, it left behind a memorandum, some disputed radiation readings, some ground traces that have been variously interpreted, and the steady, insistent testimony of people who were there, and who say that what they experienced was not something they have ever been able to account for. The forest does not answer questions. It simply holds the dark. The Poltergeist of Enfield. In August 1977, in a small council house on Green Street in Enfield, North London, a single mother named Peggy Hodgson reported to the police that furniture in her home was moving on its own. The police officers who responded to the call witnessed a chair move. The chair was in front of them on the floor, and it moved laterally without anyone touching it, more than 4 feet across the floor. One of the officers, a constable named Carolyn Heaps, signed a statement attesting to this. She saw it. It moved. This is the beginning of what became known as the Enfield Poltergeist, a case that lasted approximately 2 years that was investigated by members of the Society for Psychical Research, that was documented in photographs and audio recordings and written accounts that fill multiple volumes, and that remains after nearly 50 years one of the most controversial and in some respects most documented claims of poltergeist activity in recorded history. The Hodgson household at the time consisted of Peggy Hodgson, her 4 children, Janet, aged 11, Margaret, aged 13, Pete, aged 10, and Billy, aged 7. They were not wealthy. The council house was modest. The family was managing. After the separation from their father, things were tighter than they had been, but they were managing. The disturbances began in August 1977. Knockings from the walls and floors, furniture that shifted. The girls reported that their beds were vibrating. Peggy Hodgson reported to her neighbors and eventually to the police, and the police responded and sent officers, and one of those officers witnessed the chair move. The Society for Psychical Research sent 2 investigators. Guyon Playfair was a writer and researcher. Maurice Gross was a businessman with no prior experience in paranormal investigation, but who had joined the SPR following the death of his daughter in a road accident, and who became deeply committed to the Enfield case. Both men spent substantial time at the Hudson House. Both came to believe that something genuinely anomalous was occurring. What they documented over the following months was extraordinary in its scope and its stranges. Toys and small objects were thrown across rooms, sometimes with considerable force, sometimes traveling in trajectories that seemed inconsistent with being thrown by a person in the room. A sofa flipped over. Books flew off shelves. On one occasion, a large piece of equipment, an investigator's tape recorder, was found to have been hurled across a room and had landed at a considerable distance from where it had been placed. But the most disturbing element of the Enfield case was not the flying objects. It was the voice. Janet Hodgson, the 11-year-old girl at the center of the activity, began to speak in a voice that was not her own. It was a low, rasping, old man's voice, entirely unlike Janet's own voice, and it came from her, with her mouth in positions that vocal coaches who examined the recordings said could not produce that sound through normal speech. The voice spoke, it answered questions. It claimed to be a man named Bill, and later, a man named Fred, and it gave specific details about names and places and family circumstances that were in some cases verifiable. When researchers asked about Bill, the voice described being a man who had lived in the house previously, who had gone blind, who had gone to hospital and died in the downstairs front room. A man named Bill Wilkins, who had lived in the house and had died there under circumstances matching that description, was later traced. Bill Wilkins's son confirmed the details when he was contacted. He also confirmed his own existence, which had not been known to the researchers before they found him. There were cameras present on many occasions. There are photographs of Janet, apparently mid-flight, suspended in the air, horizontal, with nothing beneath her. These photographs have been discussed extensively. Are they evidence of genuine levitation, as the SPR investigators initially believed, or are they photographs of a child caught in the act of jumping, which would look similar? Some investigators who reviewed the photographs later concluded the latter. Others found the trajectories and positions difficult to explain as jumps. Janet Hodgson was also unambiguously caught on camera, engaging in trickery at certain points. She was filmed bending a spoon using her hands. She and her sister were observed pretending to levitate objects by throwing them when they thought they were unobserved. When confronted, Janet admitted that she had faked some things, but maintained that much of what happened was genuine. This admission has been used to dismiss the entire case. It has also been argued by those who believe the case that children in the middle of a genuine poltergeist experience might also fake things, either because they are testing their observers, or because they feel pressure to produce results, or simply because they are children, and children do things like that, and that this does not necessarily invalidate the authentic incidents. The SPR investigation was not the only investigation. The Daily Mirror sent a journalist and a photographer. The BBC sent a team. Researchers from other organizations came and went. Not all of them reached the same conclusions. Anita Gregory, a researcher who attended later in the case, concluded that the case was a hoax perpetrated primarily by the children. The debate between Gregory and Gross became bitter and personal and continued long after the Sky events at Green Street. The case ended in 1979 in the way that poltergeist cases often end quietly, without resolution, with the activity simply diminishing and stopping. The Hodgson family remained in the house. Peggy Hodgson lived there until her death in 2003. Janet grew up, had children, has given interviews over the years, has maintained consistently that much of what happened was real. She has also acknowledged the trickery, and has said that she thinks people should make up their own minds. The house on Green Street still stands. Someone else lives there now. The current residents have reported nothing unusual. Whether the Enfield poltergeist was a hoax, a genuine paranormal event, a psychological phenomenon generated by a distressed family in a stressful situation, or something else, entirely, is a question that the documentation, and the testimony, and the photographs, and the audio recordings have not definitively answered. The chair that moved in front of the police officer, the voice that knew a dead man's name, whatever was happening on Green Street in 1977, and 1978, and 1979, it was happening to real people in a real house, and it has not been explained. The man who stabbed Christopher Marlowe. On the 30th of May 1593, Christopher Marlowe, the greatest playwright in England until Shakespeare was stabbed through the eye at a house in Deptford and died. He was 29 years old. In those 29 years, he had written Dr. Faustus, Tamburlaine the Great, Edward, the Jew of Malta, and a body of poetry that included the line, "Come live with me and be my love." He had also, according to considerable evidence, been working as a spy for the Elizabeth and government. The official account of his death was this. Marlowe spent the day of the 30th of May 5th, 1893, at a house in Deptford that belonged to a widow named Elelena Bull. He was there with 3 other men, Ingram Fryer, Nicholas Ski, and Robert Polly. All 3 were connected in various ways to the intelligence network operated by Sir Francis Walsingham and later by his son Sir Thomas Walsingham, who was also Marlowe's patron. After a day, during which they apparently ate together and talked, an argument arose over the reckoning, that is, over who was to pay for the food and drink they had consumed. During the argument, Marlowe grabbed the dagger from Fraser's belt. Fraser reached back and stabbed him through the right eye. He died instantly, or nearly so. A coroner's jury ruled the death justifiable homicide, and Fraser received a royal pardon within a month. This account was accepted for centuries. It rested on a coroner's inquisition document that was discovered in 1925, and that provided far more detail than had previously been known about the circumstances of the death. But the discovery of that document, rather than settling the question, opened it up further because the more people looked at it, the stranger it became. The 3 men who were with Marlowe when he died were not ordinary bystanders who happened to be present at an argument. Robert Polly was an active intelligence agent who had played a key role in uncovering the Babington plot, the conspiracy to assassinate Elizabeth I that led to the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. Nicholas Ski was also connected to the intelligence network and had a history of involvement in fraud and conspiracy. Ingram Fryer was a business associate of Thomas Walsingham and a man of dubious reputation. All 3 men had connections to the world of spies and informers and secret operations that characterized the Elizabethan state. At the same time that these 3 men were in Deptford with Marlowe, Marlowe was himself in serious trouble. The Privy Council had recently ordered his arrest on charges of heresy. A playwright named Thomas Kidd had been arrested and tortured, and under torture had claimed that blasphemous papers found in his lodgings had actually belonged to Marlowe. Other informers had made various accusations against Marlowe, that he denied the divinity of Christ, that he made tobacco and boys his companions in sin, that he was a spy who had been speaking to the enemy. These accusations, if proved, could have led to his execution. So Marlowe was facing possible arrest, possible torture, possible death at the hands of the Elizabethan state. And then he was killed in the company of 3 men who worked for that state in a dispute over who was to pay for dinner. The theories about what actually happened are numerous and have been developed over many decades of scholarship. The simplest theory that diverges from the official account is that Marlowe was murdered on the orders from someone powerful, and that the argument over the reckoning was a cover story, invented by the 3 men present, who would have ordered it. Candidates include anyone who feared what Marlowe might say under torture if he were arrested, which means people with secrets that Marlowe knew. His years of intelligence work would have given him considerable knowledge of dangerous things. There is the Marlowe as Shakespeare theory, which holds that Marlowe did not actually die in Deptford, but was spirited away by his powerful patrons, given a new identity, and continued writing under Leake, the name of the actor from Stratford. This theory has a devoted following and is almost universally rejected by academic scholars, who point out that the documentary evidence for William Shakespeare authorship is substantial, that the theory requires an implausibly vast conspiracy, and that the resemblances between Marlowe's style and Shakespeare's style, while real, are not more striking than the stylistic evolution you would expect from a playwright developing over time. The Marlovian theory is mentioned here not as a credible scholarly position, but because it demonstrates how completely Marlowe's death has refused to be settled. What is certain is that Christopher Marlowe died in Deptford at 29, in company of spies, during a crisis that threatened to expose secrets that the Elizabeth and state needed kept. The coroner's inquisition records the bare facts. It does not record what was said in that room before the dagger was drawn. It does not record what any of those 4 men were actually there for, what they discussed through that long spring day. It does not record what Marlowe knew that someone needed him to not say. The eye through which he was stabbed, the pardon that came within the month, the plays that stopped, the question of who in that room knew exactly what they were doing and why. It is 500 years ago, and it is not resolved. Spring healed Jack, and the terror in the streets. In the winter of 1837, and the years that followed, something was attacking people in London and the surrounding counties, and nobody knew what it was. The description that emerged from multiple witnesses from locations across southern England was this: a tall figure, taller than an ordinary man with a lean, athletic build, wearing what appeared to be a dark cloak. The figure could jump to extraordinary heights, clearing walls and gates that no ordinary person could clear. It breathed fire, or something resembling fire, in blue or white flames. Its eyes, witnesses said, were red and glowing like coals. It laughed as it attacked, a high, mocking laugh that people described as inhuman. It grabbed women, tore at their clothing, scratched their faces with metal claws, and then leaped away into the darkness before anyone could apprehend it. It was given a name: Spring-Heeled Jack. The first formal reports came to the Lord Mayor of London in January 1838. A servant named Polly reportedly attacked in the autumn of 1837. A woman named Mary Stevens reported being grabbed in a lane in Clapham Common, her clothes torn, scratched by cold metal fingers. The following day, near that same area, a figure jumped in front of a carriage, causing the driver to crash. Witnesses said the figure jumped 25 to 30 feet to escape over a wall. In February 1838, Spring-Heeled Jack knocked at the door of a house in Turner Street, Whitechapel, and asked to speak to the resident, a man named Mr. Allop. His daughter, Jane Allop, answered the door. The figure outside identified itself as a police officer and said there was a suspicious person outside and they needed a light. Jane Allop brought a candle. She later testified that when the light fell on the figure's face, it was not a human face. She described the eyes as balls of fire. She described blue and white flames coming from its mouth. She described metal claws on its hands. The figure grabbed her and began tearing at her clothes and scratching her. Her screams brought her sisters, who pulled her inside. The figure disappeared. A week or so later, a young woman named Lucy Scales and her sister were walking through Green for Dragon Alley in Limehouse when a figure stepped out and breathed fire into Lucy Scales's face, blinding her temporarily. Her sister saw the figure jump away with effortless, inhuman bounds. The reports spread. The newspapers covered them. The Lord Mayor held a public meeting. Various theories were proposed, including the theory that it was a collection of pranksters rather than a single entity, or that it was wealthy young men conducting a wager that involved terrorizing people. The figure of the aristocratic prankster was a type in the popular imagination of early Victorian England, and the extreme physical capabilities that witnesses described were sometimes explained as theatrical devices: spring-loaded boots, flammable chemicals secreted in a helmet or mask. The Marquis of Waterford has been proposed as a suspect. Henry Dapoa Beresford, the third Marquis of Waterford, was a notorious prankster and rake who had the means and arguably the temperament for elaborate public mischief. He is known to have been in the Alton area of Hampshire, where Spring Jack sightings also occurred during relevant periods. He was physically imposing, athletic, wealthy enough to afford whatever props might be required. He married in 1842 and settled down somewhat, and the London sightings diminished around that time. This has been taken as suggestive by some researchers. The problem with the Marquis of Waterford theory is that it requires him to have been in many different places simultaneously, because Spring-Heeled Jack did not stay in London. Over the following decades, reports came from across England. From Sheffield in 1873, where a figure matching the description was reported jumping across rooftops. From Lincolnshire, from the naval town of Aldershot in 1877, where centuries reported a figure that ran among them, breathed fire in their faces, slapped some of them, and then leaped away over a 10-foot wall with apparent ease. The sentries were soldiers. They fired at the figure. The bullets appeared to have no effect. The figure laughed and jumped away. The Marquis of Waterford died in a riding accident in 1859, but the sightings continued long after his death. There were reports from Everton in Liverpool in 1904, where crowds gathered to watch a figure leaping between rooftops and houses with extraordinary bounds, attracting such attention that local police were called. There are reports from other locations through the early 20th century. The last widely cited report is usually given as 1904 or thereabouts, but occasional sightings have been claimed even into the later 20th century. What was it? The most sober assessment is that it was a mixture of things: genuine encounters with an unknown person or persons using theatrical devices or unusual physical abilities, newspaper amplification, and sensationalism that encouraged others to report their own frightening encounters and frame them using the established Spring-Heeled Jack description. Mass hysteria feeding on itself in a period of significant social anxiety at the beginning of the Victorian era, and possibly some cases of pure invention or misidentification. But this assessment does not fully account for the multiple independent witnesses, including the soldiers at Aldershot who fired their weapons. It does not account for the specific, consistent details that appear across decades and across large geographic distances. The eyes, the fire, the leaping, the laughter. Witnesses who were not reading newspapers, who did not share information with each other, described the same thing. The figure called Spring-Heeled Jack was never apprehended. It was never photographed. It left no physical evidence. It exists only in the testimony of the people who claim to have seen it, whose descriptions were recorded in newspapers and official records and police reports and personal memoirs. What they all described is something that the Victorian world could not explain, and that, in the final accounting, is all we can say with certainty. Something was out there, in the dark streets, and the jumping distances, and the cold air, before the VEC gas lamps went fully out. It was laughing as it went. The disappearance of Agatha Christie. On the morning of the 4th of December 1926, the car belonging to the author Agatha Christie was found abandoned near a chalk pit at Newlands Corner in Surrey. The engine was running, the headlights were on. Christie's coat was inside the car. On the back seat, in some accounts, there were some personal effects and the unfinished manuscript of a novel. Agatha Christie herself was nowhere to be found. She was missing for 11 days. The disappearance happened at a specific moment in Christie Ismole's personal life that has shaped how it has been interpreted. Her mother had died earlier in 1926, which had devastated her. Her husband of several years, Colonel Archibald Christie, had announced that he wanted a divorce so that he could marry his mistress, a woman named Nancy Neal. Christie had driven from her home, Styles House in Sunningale, and vanished. The search was enormous. It became a national event. 15,000 volunteers joined police in searching the countryside around Newlands Corner. The famous crime writer Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes, became involved and submitted one of Christie's gloves to a medium who he believed might be able to use it to locate her psychically. Dorothy Elsa, another crime writer, walked the local area herself, attempting to apply detective methods. Divers searched the lake at Newlands Corner. Bloodhounds were used. Aircraft were deployed. There was no body. There was no ransom note. There was no sign of foul play. There was just the car, with the engine running, and the lights on, and the absence. Archibald Christie was briefly suspected. He was, after all, in the process of ending the marriage, and a missing or dead wife was, in some respects, convenient. He had, on the night of Christie's disappearance, gone to a party at the home of a friend with Nancy Neal. He was questioned by police and maintained throughout that he had nothing to do with his wife's disappearance. On the 14th of December, 1926, Agatha Christie was found. She was at a spa hotel in Harriet, in Yorkshire, the Swan Hydropathic Hotel, where she had been staying under the name of Teresa Neal, the surname Neal, the same as her husband's mistress. She had apparently been there since shortly after her disappearance, attending dances and social events at the hotel, participating in the normal life of the establishment. Other guests had noticed that she seemed a little detached, a little unusual, but she had not attracted significant alarm. When confronted, Agatha Christie claimed to have no memory of who she was or how she had come to be at the hotel. She said she had been suffering from amnesia and did not know her own identity. She appeared genuinely distressed and confused. A doctor who examined her concluded that she had suffered a genuine episode of amnesia, possibly brought on by the extreme stress of her mother's death and her husband's announcement. Agatha Christie never publicly explained what happened during those 11 days. She wrote an autobiography that was published after her death, and in it she almost entirely omitted the period of the disappearance. The one paragraph she devoted to it acknowledged that something had happened without explaining it. She did not say where she had been. She did not say what she had done or experienced. The theories have been elaborated extensively over the century since. The most psychologically coherent explanation is that she did suffer some form of dissociative episode, a fugue state in which she was functioning and conscious, but disconnected from her ordinary sense of identity, possibly including her memories of who she was. Dissociative fugue is a real if rare condition typically triggered by extreme psychological stress. A woman who had just lost her mother and been told by her husband that he was leaving her for someone else, driving alone at night, would certainly qualify as someone under extreme psychological stress. The problem with this explanation, which most people who have studied the case note, is the name. She checked into the hotel as Teresa Neal. If she did not know who she was, why would she have chosen a false name that incorporated the surname of her husband's mistress? The choice of that specific name suggests either that she did know who she was at the moment of registration, or that her subconscious mind was operating with information that her conscious self was denying. The revenge theory holds that Christie staged the disappearance to embarrass her husband, to make him a suspect, to punish him for his betrayal. This has a certain psychological logic. It does not explain why she then agreed to return without exacting any public price from her husband. It does not explain why she never broke her silence for the remaining 50 years of her life. The publicity theory holds that it was a calculated stunt to generate attention for her books. This is the least persuasive theory and has almost no serious proponents. Whatever happened, Agatha Christie and Archibald Christie divorced in 1928. Archibald married Nancy Neal. Agatha remarried in 1930 to the archaeologist Max Mallowan, and the marriage was by all accounts happy. She continued writing until shortly before her death in 1976, producing approximately 66 detective novels and establishing herself as the best-selling fiction writer of the 20th century. She took whatever she knew to her grave, a woman who devoted her life to constructing mysteries in which all the clues eventually resolve into answers, chose in the end to leave her own greatest mystery permanently open. Whether that was deliberate or not, it was perfect. The Wallace case. In the evening of the 20th of January, 1931, a telephone call was placed to the Liverpool Central Chess Club. The caller asked for a member named William Herbert Wallace and left a message requesting that Wallace attend an address in Menlo Gardens East the following evening for a business appointment. The man who answered the telephone noted the caller and took down the message. The message was given to Wallace when he arrived for his chess game that evening. On the following evening, the 21st of January, Wallace went to look for Menlo Gardens East in Liverpool. He spent considerable time searching. He asked multiple people for directions. He knocked on doors. He eventually established conclusively that Menlo Gardens East did not exist. There were Menlo Gardens North, and Menlo Gardens West, and Menlo Gardens South. There was no East. He returned home. When he arrived at his house on Wolverton Street in the Anfield area of Liverpool, his neighbour, a woman named Mrs. Johnston, was standing outside. He told her he could not get in, that his back door was fastened. Mrs. Johnston and her husband came with him to the back door. He tried it again and found it was not locked. He went inside with the Johnstons waiting at the door. Within minutes, he came back out. His wife, Julia, had been battered to death in the front parlor. She was found lying on the floor, 11 or more blows to her head, with what appeared to be an iron bar or similar implement. The house showed no sign of forced entry. Nothing obvious had been stolen, though the police later determined that a small cash box which Wallace kept in his bedroom had been opened, and a small amount of money was missing. William Herbert Wallace was arrested, tried for the murder of his wife, Julia, convicted by a jury, and sentenced to death. He appealed. The Court of Criminal Appeal quashed the conviction, holding that the verdict was unreasonable and could not be supported having regard to the evidence. This was at the time an extremely unusual outcome for the Court of Criminal Appeal, which was generally very reluctant to overturn jury verdicts. Wallace was released. He lived for another 2 years, died of kidney disease that may have predated the murder, and maintained his innocence until the end. The Wallace case has been called the perfect murder mystery. It has been called the most baffling murder case in the history of British crime. Raymond Chandler described it as the impossible murder case. And the core of what makes it so baffling is simply this. Either William Wallace committed an extremely elaborate murder with an extremely complex, false alibi, involving a fake phone call, an invented address, and an implausible amount of logistical preparation, or someone else committed an extremely elaborate murder with an extremely complex false alibi, specifically designed to implicate William Wallace. Both options are disturbing, and both have been argued at length by serious investigators. The case against Wallace is circumstantial but extensive. He was an insurance agent of known methodical intelligence. He was 52 years old and in poor health, which has been used both against him in that a frail man might need to construct an alibi rather than overpower a victim physically, and for him in that, some researchers have argued, he could not physically have done what was done to Julia Wallace. The marriage was by all accounts respectful, but not passionate. They had no children. There were some financial pressures. But the phone call is the thing. The phone call to the chess club was made from a public telephone box near Wallace's own street, not more than 400 yards from his house. This is either damning if he made it, because it shows he was willing to risk making the call so close to home, or exculpatory, because if he was going to go to the trouble of constructing an elaborate false alibi, he might have been expected to make the call from further away. The voice of the caller was recorded as confident and articulate. The chess club operator, who noted the message, later testified that he could not be certain it was Wallace's voice. The prime alternative suspect has always been a man named Richard Gordon Perry. Perry was a young man who had worked for the same insurance company as Wallace, and who knew the Wallaces and their home. He was unreliable, dishonest, and in financial trouble. He had an alibi for the night of the murder, but the alibi came from his girlfriend, and was therefore not independent. Years after the case, a man named Jonathan Goodman, who wrote a book about the Wallace case, found and interviewed a garage owner who said that Richard Gordon Perry had come to his garage in the days after the murder and had been extremely anxious to use the garage's jet cleaning hose to clean his car, which the garage owner had thought at the time was unusual. Perry died in 1980, and whatever he knew died with him. The murder weapon was never found. The precise time of Julia Wallace's death was disputed by medical witnesses at trial in ways that were significant to the question of whether Wallace had time to commit the murder and get to some. Men love gardens. The amount of blood found on Wallace's clothing when he was examined was, the defense argued, consistent with a man who had found his wife's body and tried to help her, not with a man who had just beaten her to death. The Court of Criminal Appeal was not wrong to quash the conviction. The evidence against Wallace was insufficient to have supported it beyond reasonable doubt. But that conclusion does not tell us who killed Julia Wallace, who made the phone call to the chess club, and why. Wolverton Street in Liverpool still exists. The house where Julia Wallace died is still there. The chess club was at a hotel that no longer serves the same function. Men love gardens. North and west and south are still there, and so is the gap where east would have been. The perfect murder mystery has so far remained perfect. The bog bodies in the peat bogs of Britain and Ireland, and across the broader landscape of Northern Europe, The ground has been returning the dead for a very long time. Not the skeletal dead, not the decomposed and reduced to fragments dead. The dead whose skin and hair and internal organs, and in some cases facial expressions, have been preserved by the chemistry of the bog. The low temperature and the oxygen-poor and highly acidic environment of deep peat, which inhibits decomposition and tans the skin in a way that turns it to leather. The bog bodies, of which hundreds have been found across northern Europe, are some of the most startling objects in archaeology because they are so much more present than you expect. Ancient dead to be. In Britain, some of the most significant finds have come from the north of England. Lindow Man is the most famous. On the 1st of August 1984, peat workers at Lindow Moss in Cheshire were loading peat from a cutting machine when a piece of bog came down a conveyor belt and turned out to contain a preserved human foot. The police were called. 2 weeks later, on the 14th of August, further excavation revealed the remains of a body preserved in the peat to a remarkable degree. It was, investigators established, the body of a man who had been in his mid to late 20s at the time of death. He was well nourished, his nails were manicured, he had been healthy in the period before he died, his beard and hair were trimmed. By these physical indicators, he was not a poor or marginal person. He had been well cared for. He had also been killed very deliberately and very thoroughly. Lindow Man, as he has come to be known, the name taken from the moss where he was found, died from multiple causes. He had been struck on the top of the head at least twice with considerable force. His neck had been garroted, a cord or ligature tightened until the blood supply to the brain was cut off. His throat had been cut. These three methods applied simultaneously, or in close succession, have been interpreted by some archaeologists as a ritual killing rather than simply murder, because a ritual killing might require multiple methods to fulfill specific ceremonial requirements. The concept of the threefold death, death by striking and strangulation and throat-cutting, or drowning, appears in Celtic mythology in a context that suggests sacrifice. Lindow Man's death matches this pattern closely. He was radio-Arban dated to somewhere between the 1st century B.C.E. and the 1st century CE, a period covering the late Iron Age and the Roman invasion of Britain. He had eaten a meal of flatbread shortly before his death, bread made from many types of grain, which has been analyzed in detail. He had also consumed some quantities of mistletoe pollen, which some archaeologists have interpreted as significant, given the role of mistletoe in the ritual practices of the Druids, as described by Roman writers. Who was Lindow Man? The manicured nails, the good health, the high-quality bread suggest somebody of status. The ritual killing pattern suggests, if it was ritual, that he was considered an appropriate sacrifice. This has led to speculation that he was himself a high-status individual, possibly a priest or a king, possibly someone who went to his death willingly, as part of a ritual that his community believed had real power over the world. But this is interpretation layered on inference, layered on physical evidence. We do not know his name. We do not know whether he chose to die or was killed against his will. We do not know what his people believed his death would accomplish. We know how he died. We know what he ate beforehand. We know that he was healthy and had been cared for. The rest is silence. Lindow Man is not alone. Worley Man, found in Lanarkshire in 1958, was decapitated and the severed head preserved in a bog. He dates to the late Iron Age and shows evidence of having been struck on the head and garroted, the same combination as Lindow Man. Roosecar, found in Yorkshire, was a carved wooden figure of considerable age. Not a body, but an artifact that speaks to the ritual life of the period. In other parts of Britain, other remarkable bog finds have emerged. In Scotland, the Galloway Hoard, found in 2014, was a remarkable collection of objects buried in a bog in the early medieval period, including items from across the known world of the time. Viking artifacts alongside items that had travelled from as far as Central Asia, all buried together in what appears to have been a significant and deliberate act. The bogs of Britain are strange landscapes. They are at once ancient and preserved environments where time behaves differently, where the normal processes of decay are suspended and things last in ways they are not supposed to last. Walking across a bog, if you have ever done it, has a quality that is difficult to describe, and that people have been describing for as long as there have been words. The ground gives under your feet. It is alive and dead at the same time. The sound is muffled. The horizon seems both close and far into these landscapes. For thousands of years, people have placed things, bodies, and objects and hoards, things they wanted preserved, things they needed to give to whatever was below, things that were too important to simply bury in the ground or keep in a building. The bogs kept what was given to them, for 2,000 years, for 3,000 years, and then the peat cutters came. What those preserved faces hold, what those carefully killed bodies were supposed to accomplish, what those people knew and believed and feared. The bog has given us the physical remains and kept everything else. The faces are sometimes still recognizable as faces. Lindow-Mann's features are preserved enough that facial reconstruction has been attempted. A face emerging from the dark leather of the preserved skin, looking out at us from 2,000 years ago with an expression that is neither quite peaceful nor quite frightened. He is watching from across an enormous distance, and we cannot hear what he is trying to say. The bridge where dogs leap. The Overtown Bridge is a single-arch stone bridge in the grounds of the Overtown estate near Dumbarton in West Bartonshire, Scotland. It was built in 1895. It is beautiful in the way that Victorian stonework often is solid and a little melancholy and permanent seeming. It spans the Overton Burn, a small stream far below in a wooded gorge. Since the 1950s or 1960s, more than 50 dogs have leaped from the bridge to the rocks below. Not all of them have died. Some have survived the fall, been recovered by their horrified owners, and then in several recorded cases, when brought back to the top of the bridge, have tried to jump again. The phenomenon has been documented by journalists and researchers and veterinarians. It has been featured in documentaries and newspaper investigations in multiple countries. It is one of the strangest and most persistent behavioral anomalies associated with a specific location that has ever been reliably recorded. The dogs that have jumped are overwhelmingly long-nosed breeds: Labradors, Retrievers, Collies, Spaniels, dogs with powerful scent-tracking abilities. This has been consistently noted by researchers and is the key detail in the most credible explanation that has been put forward. The most plausible, rational explanation involves smell. The gorge beneath the bridge is dense with vegetation, including trees and undergrowth, and it is home to mink, which were introduced to Scotland in the 20th century as a fur farming animal and have since established wild populations across the country. Mink are intensely aromatic. They produce strong musk from scent glands, and this smell is distinctive and potent. The theory is that dogs with powerful noses walking along the parapet of the bridge catch the smell of mink from below, become intensely focused on it, and in attempting to follow it, misjudge or disregard the edge of the bridge. In the grip of a strong scent drive, a dog may simply not process the fact that it is at a height and step off into space. This explanation has the advantage of being consistent with the observable facts: the bridge's location and the presence of mink below it, the predominance of long-nosed scent-following breeds among the jumpers, and the fact that the jumps appear to occur at a consistent location on the bridge rather than randomly along its length, specifically at the section where the parapet wall is low enough for a medium to large dog to get its head over and potentially get a good line on the smell below. A researcher named David Stone, working with the Dumbarton-based charity, the Scottish SPCA, conducted an investigation that found strong concentrations of mincent in the gorge below, the specific section of the bridge from which dogs most frequently leap. This finding supports the mink scent theory. Why then does a dog that has survived the fall and been brought back to the top sometimes try to jump again? The mink scent is presumably still present. The drive that produced the first leap is presumably still active. A dog's nervous system does not perform a cost-benefit analysis of past near-death experiences in the way a human would. If the drive is powerful enough, the absence of fear is complete enough. The jump may simply be repeated. This explanation, careful and rational, and supported by evidence, is the most credible one. But it is not universally accepted, partly because the documentation of the phenomenon is not complete enough to rule out other contributing factors, and partly because there is something about the repeated behavior of dogs that survive and return that does not quite sit inside the Minx explanation with perfect comfort. The legend of the Overtone Bridge, the local nickname White Lady's Bridge, refers to a tradition of a ghostly female figure associated with the estate seen in the area over the years. The Overtown estate itself has a human tragedy connected to it. In 1994, a man named Kevin Moy threw his infant son from the bridge, believing the child to be the Antichrist. He then tried to throw himself from the bridge. This terrible event is part of the place's history. Whether it connects to the dog-leaping phenomenon is impossible to say. Events do not cause each other simply by occurring in proximity, but the bridge stands. Dogs continue to walk across it. Owners stand on the parapet and look over at the gorge below, where the mink move through the thick undergrowth, and the water runs over the stones, and try to keep their animals close. The phenomenon is documented. The most credible explanation is available. And yet the specificity of it, the single bridge, the recurring behavior, the dogs that try again, sits at the edge of what the explanation fully covers. Some places simply accumulate strangers. The bridge near Dumbarton is one of them. Amy Robsart and the staircase at Cumnor Place. On the 8th of September 1560, a woman named Amy Robsart was found dead at the foot of a staircase at Cumnor Place in Oxfordshire. Her neck was broken. The house had been deliberately emptied of servants that morning. Her husband, Robert Dudley, was 30 miles away at Windsor. He had been sent a message before her body was discovered that the situation at Cumnor Place was very uncertain. He sent people to investigate the same day. Robert Dudley was the favourite of Queen Elizabeth I, one of England. He was handsome and charming, and the Queen called him her sweet Robin, and gave him lands and titles and the freedom of her presence that no other man had to the same degree. People talked. They had talked since early in Elizabeth's reign, which had begun only 2 years before Amy's death in 1558. They speculated about the exact nature of the Queen's relationship with Dudley, and whether it would lead to marriage, and what would happen to Amy Robsart, who had been Dudley's wife since 1550, when both of them were teenagers, and had since become an impediment, in fact, if not in law. Amy had been ill. The nature of her illness is part of the mystery. In the weeks before her death, according to letters from people who encountered her, she had been speaking of her life in terms that suggested she expected it to end soon. She had been described by one correspondent as very sad and pensive. A letter written by someone in her household around this period mentions her concern that she not be left alone. She had also reportedly told one person that she prayed to God to deliver her from desperation. That word, desperation, it has been interpreted as evidence that she was suicidal, or that she feared what was coming to her, or that she was simply very ill and frightened of dying. On the morning of the 8th of September 1560, Amy Robsart instructed all her servants to go to the local fair at Abington. When some of them expressed reluctance to leave her alone, she insisted, apparently with some force, they went. She was alone in the house with possibly 2 women who had remained behind, though the details of who exactly was present are disputed. She was found at the bottom of the staircase with her neck broken and 2 wounds to her head. An inquest was held. It returned a verdict of misfortune, which in the terminology of the period meant accidental death. This verdict was taken at face value by some and dismissed as a cover-up by others almost immediately. The problem for any theory of Amy Robart's death is structural. Each of the most plausible explanations has significant difficulties. Accident. A woman falls down a staircase and breaks her neck. This is a perfectly ordinary way to die, and it happened more frequently before the age of modern building regulations. But the servants had been sent away that morning at Amy's own insistence, which might indicate that she knew what was coming, either because she planned to kill herself or because she had been warned to expect visitors. The head wounds are described variously in the sources, as superficial or as significant. If they were significant, A simple fall becomes harder to explain. Suicide. Amy leaped from the top of the staircase, or threw herself down it. If she was suffering from a serious illness, possibly cancer of the breast, as some medical historians have suggested, based on the symptom descriptions in the letters, and if she had been speaking in terms that suggested she expected death, a decision to die on her own terms is not impossible. The religious and social prohibitions against suicide were severe in Elizabeth and England, which may be why the inquest returned a verdict of misfortune. This interpretation has the advantage of explaining why Amy sent the servants away, and why she had been speaking strangely in the preceding weeks. Murder ordered by Robert Dudley. Dudley needed Amy to die in order to be free to pursue the Queen. Her death occurring when it did cleared the way for a potential marriage to Elizabeth. But Dudley had been warned, seemingly before the body was found, that something was happening at Cumnor Place, which either means he knew what was going to happen, or means he received advanced warning that has a more innocent explanation. He also behaved afterward in the way of a man who had been shocked and who was concerned about the consequences, sending investigators asking for a careful inquest, expressing alarm. If he ordered the murder, he took a tremendous risk that the investigation would find evidence against him. Murder ordered by someone else, possibly Seal, Elizabeth's chief minister. Sealer was deeply opposed to a Dudley marriage and would have known that Amy's death would damage Dudley rather than help him. If Amy were killed and it looked like murder, Dudley would be destroyed. This theory has the dark elegance of removing the main obstacle and simultaneously ruining the men it removed it for. The staircase at Cumnor Place no longer exists. Cum Place itself was demolished in the 18th century. There is nothing to stand on or look at. The physical evidence, such as it was examined only by an Elizabethan inquest and is gone. What remains is the letter evidence, the contemporary accounts, the political context, and the fact that Robert Dudley's career and his relationship with the Queen survived Amy's death, though never without the shadow of suspicion that had attached to him from the moment her body was found. Elizabeth, the never married. Whether she would have married Dudley if Amy had not died, or if Amy had died more cleanly and less ambiguously, is one of the great counterfactual questions of English history. Amy Robsart is buried in the University Church of St. Mary the Virgin in Oxford. Her brass memorial was removed during the Civil War and lost. She is there, but you cannot see her face. She is there, but the record does not properly hold her. Whatever happened at the bottom of that staircase, she took it with her. The Cottingley Fairies. In the summer of 1917, in the village of Cottingley, in West Yorkshire, two girls photographed fairies, or they photographed something that looked like fairies. Website, or they created a series of photographs using paper cutouts from a book, and hat pins, and a threeman, belonging to the elder girl's father, and then photographed those cutouts in a way that was convincing enough to deceive for several years some of the most intelligent people in theories. The girls were Frances Griffiths, who was 10 years old, and her cousin Elsie Wright, who was 16. Elsie borrowed her father's camera, a MIJ quarterplate camera, and the photographs they took in and around the beck. The small stream at the bottom of the Wrights' garden became within a few years one of the most famous paranormal controversies of the 20th century. There are 5 photographs in total. The first, taken in July 1917, shows Frances looking directly at the camera, while a group of small winged figures dances in the foreground, close to her face. The figures are lit differently from Frances, which several later analysts have noted. The second, taken in September 1917, shows Elsie sitting in the grass with a small figure, appearing to stand on her knee. The third photograph, taken in 1920, when investigators had become involved, shows Frances with a leaping figure. The fourth shows Elsie and a fairy offering her a small flower. The fifth, the most artistically accomplished of the group, shows a translucent figure of the kind associated with Victorian fairy imagery, hovering in front of a bush. The photographs came to the attention of a woman named Polly Wright, Elsie's mother, who showed them at a Theosophical Society meeting in Bradford in 1919. Theosophy was a philosophical and spiritual movement that took seriously the existence of nature spirits and similar entities, and the photographs attracted considerable excitement in those circles. From there, word reached Edward Gardner, a leading theosophist, who took the photographs and had them examined by a photographic expert named Harold Snelling, who concluded they were genuine photographs of natural objects in motion, not studio fakes. Gardner brought the photographs to the attention of Arthur Conan Doyle, who was writing an article about fairies for the Strand magazine. Conan Doyle was by 1919 and 1920 deeply committed to spiritualism and deeply invested in the reality of the spirit world. The loss of his son Kingsley in the influenza pandemic, following the death of other family members in the war, had pushed him into a grief-driven faith that the boundary between the living and the dead was thinner than materialism suggested. He saw the Cottingley photographs as confirmation. Conan Doyle's endorsement of the photographs, published in the Strand magazine in December 1920, and developed into a book called The Coming of the Fairies in 1922, gave the case a level of public attention it would never otherwise have achieved. Conan Doyle was world famous, his credibility was enormous, and he was completely convinced. The girls throughout this period maintained their story. They did not recant. They submitted to interviews with investigators, including Gardner, who visited Cottingley in 1920. Gardner gave the girls new cameras and unexposed plates so that fresh photographs could be taken, and the girls produced the 3 photographs of 1920 using these materials. This was taken as confirmation that the fairies were genuinely present and not a product of theatrical preparation. For 60 years, the girls did not publicly recant. In 1981, a journalist named Joe Cooper interviewed the girls, who were now elderly women, Frances in her 70s and Elsie in her 80s. Elsie admitted that the first 4 photographs had been faked using paper cutouts from a book of fairy illustrations called Princess Mary's Gift Book, published in 1914, held in place with hat pins. The cutouts were positioned in the grass or on a knee or near a face, and then photographed. She said that Frances had not wanted to admit the deception and had been reluctant to come forward. Frances, for her part, did admit the first 4 photographs were faked, but she maintained until her death that the 5th photograph, the translucent hovering figure, was real. She said that there had been something real in that beck, that the fairies were genuinely there, even if most of the photographs did not show them, and that the 5th photograph captured something genuine that she and Elsie had not fabricated. This is the detail that refuses to be fully resolved. 2 women in their 80s, one of whom has already admitted to fabricating 4 photographs, one of whom has admitted the same, and one of them is still saying the 5th one was real. Either Frances Griffiths, at the end of her life, was maintaining a 60-year deception to the point of her own grave, or she was telling a truth that her cousin was not prepared to acknowledge, or her memory of the events was not fully reliable after so many decades. The 5th photograph has been analyzed. Some researchers find it more explicable as a cutout than the others. Others find it genuinely difficult to account for with the same method. The translucent quality of the figure, which is different from the flat paper appearance of the figures in the first 4 photographs, has attracted particular interest. Frances Griffiths died in 1986. Elsie Wright died in 1988. Whatever they saw or did not see at the bottom of the garden in Cottingley in 1917 is now permanently inaccessible. The beck is still there. The garden is still there. The village of Cottingley has a commemorative trail for visitors interested in the history. What was on those plates, and what was at the bottom of that garden, and what one old woman was still insisting on in the face of all pressure to the contrary? That is the question that Cottingley leaves you with. The disappearing army of Norfolk. On the 10th of August 1915 at Gallipoli, soldiers from the 1st 5th Battalion of the Norfolk Regiment were observed advancing into a forest of low scrub and trees during the August offensive. The soldiers went into the forest. The forest was subsequently observed by New Zealand soldiers from a vantage point on a nearby ridge. The forest appeared to lift into the air, part of a low cloud formation that had been hovering over the area. When the cloud moved on, the forest was there. The soldiers were not. Some 250 officers and men of the Norfolk Regiment who entered that forest were never seen again. This story, as I have just told it, is partially a legend and partially history, and disentangling them requires some care. The historical facts are these. During the August offensive at Gallipoli in 1915, the 5th Norfolks, as part of a larger operation involving multiple battalions, were ordered to advance. In the confusion of battle, which at Gallipoli was extreme, parts of the battalion became separated and advanced further than ordered. A group of men, the exact number of which was disputed in the immediate aftermath and has been disputed since, were cut off and killed or captured by Ottoman forces. Their commanding officer, Colonel Sir Horace Beauchamp, was among those who advanced and was found dead after the armistice when the site could be searched. The bodies of many of the lost 5th Norfolks were found after the war ended. They had died fighting. Some had been taken prisoner and died in captivity. The mystery of the disappearance, in the strictly factual sense, was resolved. They were killed in action or taken prisoner in the chaos of a difficult battle on difficult terrain. But the legend persisted. The legend grew from a statement made by several New Zealand soldiers after the battle to the effect that they had observed a number of low clouds or formations that seemed to lift from the ground near the wood that the Norfolks entered, and that after the clouds moved on, the troops who had entered the wood were gone. This statement, taken by some as describing an otherworldly phenomenon, a literal dematerialization of troops into the clouds, was published in various forms and became an enduring paranormal story about the battle. The New Zealand soldiers who described the cloud formation were interviewed by researchers decades later, and some maintained the essential details of their account. The question of what they actually witnessed, a natural cloud formation in a confused battle, environment being misinterpreted, or something they genuinely did not know how to account for, is not fully resolvable. The loss of the 5th Norfolks was a real tragedy. Among those who vanished was an equity to the king, which gave the case a particular royal resonance, and ensured it was investigated after the war. The king himself took an interest in finding out what had happened to his household member. The mass deaths of Gallipoli, a campaign that is one of the most catastrophic in British and Dominion military history, were replicated across the landscape in ways that produced enormous numbers of missing men, with no known graves. The chaotic and lethal nature of the fighting, the difficult terrain, the heat, the disease, the mismanagement at the highest levels of command, all of these created conditions in which death was both common and often unrecorded. The 5th Norfolks are not fully mysterious in the end. They died in battle. But the story that attached itself to their deaths, the story of the clouds and the vanishing, of men who walked into a wood and were absorbed by something that lifted into the sky, is a story that Britain's grief at what happened at Gallipoli generated and held on to. Some losses are too large to be explained by ordinary language. Some absences require extraordinary framings. The forest at Gallipoli that the Norfolks walked into is still there. The land is different now, a century older, quieter. The monuments to the dead are there. The names on those monuments are there. The clouds that may or may not have gathered over that wood on the 10th of August, 1915, are gone without record into the past where all clouds go. The Oxford professor and the severed hand. In 1868, a curator at the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford received a collection of objects from a British military officer who had served in the Andaman Islands in the Bay of Bengal. Among the objects in the collection was a human hand, dried and preserved with what appeared to be writing on its skin, and various small items attached to it with thread. The hand had, according to the officer's notes, been taken from the body of a man who had been executed for murder in England, and had been used, as far as he could establish, as a component in a form of thieves' magic. Specifically, it was described as a hand of glory. The hand of glory is one of the more unsettling objects in British folklore history, according to a tradition that runs through witchcraft trials and folk belief. From the 17th through the 19th century, a hand of glory was the preserved hand of a hanged man, used by thieves as a magical tool to render the inhabitants of a house unconscious while they robbed. The hand could be used as a candle holder, with candles made from the fat of the hanged man burning from between the fingers, or the fingers themselves could be set alight. If the magic worked, everyone in the house would be unable to wake or move until the hand was extinguished. The belief is documented in multiple sources from multiple centuries. It was taken seriously enough by some communities that remedies were recorded alongside the description of the threat. The most common remedy cited in several folk sources was milk. Pouring milk on the threshold would prevent the hand of glory from working, whether because of its purifying properties or for some other symbolic reason. Milk was the countercharm. What makes the hand of glory particularly interesting as a British mystery is the number of times it appears not just as a folk belief, but as something that appears to have been actually constructed and actually used, or at least actually kept for the purpose. The most famous physical example is the Whitby Hand of Glory, held in the Whitby Museum in North Parrs, Yorkshire. It is genuinely a preserved human hand in a grasping posture, dried and somewhat mummified by time. It was given to the museum in 1935 by one Joseph Ford, who had received it from a family in the area. The family claimed it had been in their possession for generations. The hand has been examined and authenticated as a real human hand. It is in the museum's collection. You can go and see it. The hand in the Pitt Rivers Museum is different in character, an object collected in a colonial context and carrying its own complicated history that goes beyond the English folk tradition. But its presence in that institutional collection, alongside the Whitby example and various documentary sources, represents something real. People in Britain across several centuries actually constructed and kept these objects, which means they actually believed in, or at least hedged their bets on the possibility of the magic. The folklore of Britain is dense with objects like this. The witch bottles found buried beneath the thresholds of old houses, ceramic bottles filled with pins and hair and urine, and nails designed to protect the household against witchcraft by trapping and reflecting malign intent back at its source. The witch marks carved into beams and walls in houses from the medieval period through the 17th century. Nail, geometric patterns that look like overlapping circles, drawn in a single line, found in places of particular vulnerability. Fireplaces, doorways, windows, believed to prevent evil from entering. These are not just beliefs recorded in manuscripts. They are objects that were made and buried and carved by real people in real houses, and they are still being found today as old houses are renovated or demolished. Every year, archaeologists and builders and restorers find new witch bottles. Every year, someone removes a beam from an old house and finds the pattern carved into the wood by a hand that gripped a knife in the 16th or 17th century, a hand that believed the pattern meant something, that the gesture of making it had some power in the world. What do we do with that? What do we make of it? The most comfortable answer is to treat it as historical curiosity, evidence of pre-scientific belief systems that we have moved beyond. We understand germ theory now. We understand that illness is not caused by malicious magical intent directed at a household. The people who made those witch bottles were responding to a real fear with an inadequate tool. They were wrong about causation, and we can say that with confidence. But they made the objects anyway. They buried them in specific places. They carved the patterns at specific moments of concern. They did not, as far as we can tell, always feel that it did not work. The folk record contains more than the fear. It contains the sense of having been protected, of the bad thing not having happened, of the hand not having come for the family sleeping in their beds. Whether the hand would have come anyway is a question that the preserved hands in their museum cases do not answer. The Whitby Hand of Glory sits in its case in the museum, in a port town that also has Dracula, associations where the sea comes in grey and cold, and where the ruins of an abbey stand on a cliff top above the town. The hand is small and dark and real, and its fingers are slightly curled, as if it is still holding something, says Zent, that has long since been taken away. What it was supposed to do, nobody is saying. The Lost Children of the Moors. This chapter is slower and quieter than the others, because what it describes is more recent, and the grief it involves has not had centuries to become history. It is still personal. It is still being lived by people who are still here. Between 1963 and 1965, 5 children were abducted and murdered in and around Manchester. Their names were Pauline Reed, John Kilbride, Keith Bennett, Leslie Ann Downey, and Edward Evans. Their killers were Ian Brady, who died in prison in 2017, and Myra Hindley, who died in prison in 2002. The case became known as the Moors murders because several of the victims were buried on Saddleworth Moor, above Manchester. 4 of the 5 victims were found. Their remains were recovered, and their families were given what closure that could provide. Keith Bennett was not found. He was 12 years old when he was abducted on the 16th of June 1964. He was taken to the moor. He was murdered there. Brady and Hindley buried him somewhere on Saddleworth Moor. And despite multiple searches over more than 50 years, despite the use of ground-penetrating, radar and cadaver dogs, and specialist teams, and satellite imagery, and despite the cooperation of Brady himself in later years in describing the location, Keith Bennett's body has never been recovered. Brady made statements in his later years about the location of Keith's grave. He participated in a visit to the moor in 1987 with Hindley when both prisoners were brought there in an attempt to identify the burial site. The visit did not produce a result. The location Brady described could not be definitively identified. Whether this was because the moor had changed enough in 23 years to make identification impossible, or because Brady's memory was unreliable, or because Brady was not trying sincerely to help, is not established. Brady died in 2017 without having revealed the location clearly enough for a recovery to be made. The question of whether he knew at the end and withheld it, or whether the information was genuinely no longer accessible to him, is not answerable. Keith Bennett's mother, Winnie Johnson, spent the remaining decades of her life campaigning for the continued search of the moor. She wrote letters to Brady. She spoke publicly. She appeared in television appeals. She went to the moor. She never stopped. She died in 2012, 5 years before Brady died, without having been able to bring her son home. She was 69 years old, and she had been trying for 48 years. The moor is still searched from time to time. The searches are organized by the Greater Manchester Police and by various volunteers and specialists. New technology is applied. New techniques are developed. The moor is very large, and the conditions for preserving remains over 5 decades are uncertain. Keith Bennett is there somewhere. That is the one thing that is certain on Saddleworth Moor, in a location that has been walked over, and searched and scanned and grieved over. He is there, and the search continues because the alternative, the acceptance that he will not be found, is not something his family, or the people who loved him, or the people who simply believe in the basic obligation to bring the dead home, can entirely accept. This is not a mystery in the sense that the others in this collection are mysteries. The crime was solved. The killers were convicted. The victims, all but one, were recovered. The mystery that remains is geographic and physical and not supernatural in any sense. But it belongs in this collection because it is one of the darkest unresolved things in recent British history, and because the darkness of it is not the darkness of the unknown, it is the darkness of the known. A child is in the ground on a moor above Manchester, and we cannot find him, and his mother went to her own grave without being able to bring him home. There is nothing to add to that. The moor accepts no additions. It is simply what it is, very large, very old, and holding what it holds, the haunting of Borey Rectory. From the 1920s until its destruction by fire in 1939, Borey Rectory in Essex was described by the press, by investigators, and by the people who lived in it as the most haunted house in England. The phrase, most haunted house in England, became so attached to Borey that it is difficult to discuss the place without deploying it. It came from the work of a paranormal investigator named Harry Price, who spent years at Bolly, conducted the most extended scientific investigation of a haunted location that had up to that point been attempted in Britain, and wrote 2 books about his findings that were very widely read. What actually happened at Bolly is one of the most genuinely complicated questions in the Pronin history of British paranormal investigation. This is a case where the most honest answer is not that the phenomena were proved real, and not that they were proved to be a hoax, but that the investigation itself is the thing that is most mysterious, layered with claims and counterclaims and genuine unexplained elements, and also documented manipulation in a combination that has made reaching a definitive conclusion about Bolly essentially impossible. The rectory was built in 1863 for the Reverend Henry Bull, who established a large family in it. The Bull family began reporting unusual occurrences almost from the beginning: the sound of footsteps, unexplained lights, the figure of a nun seen walking in the garden along a path that became known as the Nun's Walk. The nun figure was described by multiple members of the Bull family over several decades. Whether the accounts influenced each other and grew through repetition, or whether multiple, independent witnesses genuinely saw something in the garden, is not determinable. The next occupant after the Bulls was the Reverend Eric Smith, who moved into the rectory in 1928 with his wife. Mrs. Smith, troubled by the atmosphere and the strange occurrences they experienced, wrote to the Daily Mirror, which sent a journalist, and separately Harry Price. From this point, Bolly's national profile exploded. Harry Price spent considerable time at Broley over the following years, and in 1937 he rented the rectory for a year to conduct a systematic investigation using a team of observers whom he had recruited through a newspaper advertisement. The observers kept meticulous notes. They documented a wide range of phenomena: messages appearing on the walls written in a shaky hand, stone-throwing objects moved, bells ringing without apparent cause, temperature drops, sounds of various kinds. Some of the observers were scientists or engineers with no prior interest in the paranormal, and no reason to embellish their accounts. Price published his findings in a book called The Most Haunted House in England in 1940, and a follow-up volume in 1946. The books were bestsellers. After Price's death in 1948, 2 investigators from the Society for Psychical Research, Eric Dingwall and Trevor Hall, reviewed his research and concluded that Price had manipulated evidence, staged phenomena himself, and produced a deeply unreliable account. Their findings were published in 1956 in a book that was devastating to Price's reputation. But then the story became more complicated again. Other researchers who looked at the case found that not everything could be attributed to Price's manipulation. The war writings, for instance, had been witnessed by multiple people, some of whom had no connection to Price in periods when Price was not at the rectory. The nun figure had been reported long before Price arrived. The fire that destroyed the rectory in 1939, set accidentally by a new owner who was sorting through papers he had purchased with the property, was witnessed by people who reported seeing figures at windows and other unusual things during the blaze, though this specific claim is difficult to assess. The rectory burned. Its ruins stood for a time and were eventually demolished. The site is now private property with a house on it. Access is not available to the public, and the current owners have made clear that they do not wish to be associated with the haunting history. What was Rectory? Was it a genuinely haunted location that attracted investigators who then distorted the record? Was it an ordinary house that Price turned into a profitable myth? Was it something in between, a location with real but mundane causes for its strangers, perhaps subsidence or acoustics, or temperature effects amplified by the power of suggestion, and then deliberately exaggerated by a showman who knew a good story when he had one? All 3 of these answers have been argued. None of them have been proved. The rectory is ash, and the key witness is dead, and the records are partial and contaminated. The most haunted house in England became the most argued about house in England, and in a way, that is its own kind of haunting. An argument that cannot be resolved, that echoes around the edges of what was there, that refuses to give up the ghost. The strange death of Hilda Marlowe. On the 21st of March 1984, a 78-year-old rose grower and nuclear power opponent named Hilda Marlowe left her home in Shrewsbury, Shropshire, in her car, and was found dead 4 days later in a copse of trees several miles from the city. She had been abducted from her own home, driven in her own car to the outskirts of Shrewsbury, and left in a field in early spring weather, inadequately dressed. She had crawled from where she was left toward the road. She had not reached it. The cause of death was hypothermia and the effects of multiple stab wounds. The facts of what happened were not established until 2003, when a man named Andrew George was convicted of her murder. George was a young man who had burgled Hilda Marlowe's house, panicked when she returned unexpectedly, abducted her, assaulted her, and abandoned her. His conviction rested on DNA evidence from material preserved from the original investigation. The conviction should have closed the case. In many respects, it did. But the nearly 20 years between Hilda Marlowe's murder in 1984 and Andrew George's conviction in 2003 were filled with a theory that once it had developed proved very difficult to let go of. Hilda Marlowe was in 1984 preparing a paper to present at an inquiry into the proposed Zwelb nuclear power station. She was an active opponent of nuclear power and had done substantial research. Her nephew was Robert Green, who had been a naval intelligence officer and who had been involved in the intelligence side of the Falklands War in 1982. Specifically, Robert Green had been connected at some level to the events surrounding the sinking of the Argentine cruiser, General Belgrano, which had been a significant political controversy in Britain because it had occurred when the Belgrano was outside the declared exclusion zone. The theory that developed and that was promoted by several journalists and by politicians, including Tam Dalyell, who raised it repeatedly in the House of Commons, was this. British intelligence services had burgled Hilda Marlowe's house looking for documents related to the Belgrano affair that her nephew might have passed to her or that she might have had access to through him. The burglary had gone wrong. She had been killed to prevent her from being a witness. The official investigation had then been suppressed or misdirected. This theory was never proved. The police investigation was criticized for its incompetence, and some of the specific, procedural failures that occurred have never been adequately explained. The theory attracted significant attention and credibility in the climate of the mid-1980s, when the Thatcher government and the intelligence services were at the center of multiple controversies. Andrew George's conviction demonstrated that the basic facts of the case were consistent, with opportunistic burglary gone wrong, exactly what it would have appeared to be to an investigator not looking for a conspiracy. The DNA evidence that led to his conviction was obtained through a systematic cold case review, and the case against him was solid. But the questions about the police investigation, about specific decisions that were made or not made in the original inquiry, about evidence that was not properly collected or followed up, have not been fully answered even after the conviction. Whether those failures were simply the product of incompetence, which would be consistent with many police investigations of the period, or whether some of them had other causes, is not fully established. Hilda Marlowe was 78 years old. She loved roses. She had spent decades cultivating her knowledge of the plants, publishing in the specialist literature, maintaining her garden. She was killed by a young man in a moment of brutal opportunism on a spring day in Shrewsbury. That is what happened. The 19 years during which the other explanations circulated, during which her death was a national political controversy, during which parliamentary questions were asked and investigations demanded, those years are part of British political history in ways that her actual death is not. The gap between the murder and its resolution produced something that had its own life, its own consequences, its own effects on public trust in institutions. The roses she grew are still in circulation. Varieties she developed and named continue to exist in gardens across Britain. She is there in the plants in the quiet, specific way that people who love one thing enough leave traces of it. The young man who killed her is in prison. The conspiracy theory that surrounded her death has been largely dismantled, though not everyone has accepted its dismantling. The gap of 19 years remains. Some of what happened in that gap has not been fully explained. That is the truth of it. And it is the uncomfortable kind. Not dramatic, not supernatural, just the specific mundane. Failure of institutions to do what they were supposed to do, with consequences that echoed for a very long time. The lost land of Lyonesse, west of Land's End in Cornwall, beyond the last lighthouse and the last reef, there is nothing for a very long way. The sea runs westward toward America, with nothing in it, except occasionally the island of Scilly, a small archipelago, 30 miles off the Cornish coast, and after that, the open Atlantic. But the old stories say that this was not always empty. The old stories say that between Cornwall and Scilly, before the sea came in, there was a land, a low, fertile land of many churches and fine harbours, and a population that lived well on the mild climate and the rich soil. Its name was Lyonesse. The story of the drowning of Lyonesse is one of the oldest traditions in Cornish and Arthurian legend. In some versions, it is the country of the knight Tristan, of the love story of Tristan and Isolde. In others, it is a kingdom that sank beneath the waves in a single night, the equivalent of the Welsh country, the Land 100, another flooded kingdom of legend, or the Breton story of the city of Yays. All of these are versions of a very widespread tradition across the cultures of the Atlantic coast of Europe. The memory of land that was drowned. The interesting thing about Lyonesse, the thing that separates it from being pure mythology, is the physical evidence. The seafloor between Cornwall and the Scilly Isles, and the shallow waters around Scilly itself, contain evidence of former land surface. Peat layers have been found at depth in these waters, peat that formed on land that required dry conditions and vegetation to form. Wood has been found, submerged trees, roots still in position, the remnants of what were once forests. The seabed topography shows features that are consistent with former river valleys, channels cut by water flowing on land, rather than sculpted by the sea. The time scale of this flooding is not mythological time. Sea levels around Britain rose significantly at the end of the last ice age, as the enormous ice sheets melted, and the water they contained returned to the oceans. The main period of this flooding was roughly between 10,000 and 6,000 years ago. The land between Cornwall and Scilly was progressively inundated during this period. Human communities were living in Britain during this process. They would have experienced the flooding over the course of generations, over centuries, and millennia. They would have watched the sea advance. The communities living on what is now the seabed between Cornwall and Scilly would have been forced, over time, to abandon their land as the water came in. The shores they knew would have receded into the water. This is not mythology. This happened. The question is whether the story of Lyonesse, carried in the oral traditions of the Cornish and Breton and Welsh cultures that share the Atlantic coast, is a genuinely ancient memory of the promaging transmitted across 6,000 years of storytelling, or whether the story developed independently from the visible physical evidence of the old land surface, the submerged trees and the peat that fishermen have always pulled up in their nets. Both possibilities are remarkable. The idea of a 6,000-year or oral memory of a specific geographic event is staggering, if true, and there are researchers who take it seriously, who argue that oral tradition can preserve real information over very long timescales when the information is embedded in story and myth, and repeated in communally significant contexts. The catastrophic flooding of a homeland is exactly the kind of event that would be repeated, would be given meaning, would be turned into a story that communities needed to tell. The alternative, that the legend grew from the observed evidence of submerged land, from the peat and the wood that Cornish fishermen have always known about and talked about, is also compelling. People do not need oral memory to understand that the sea was once lower and the land was once larger. They can see it. The Isis of Scilly themselves may be the remnants peaks of the drowned landscape. The islands are granite, hard enough to survive the inundation that swallowed the lower land around them. The people who have lived on Scilly throughout recorded history have always known that the sea, between their islands, continues to reveal old land surfaces at low tide and have always carried traditions about the drowned country. Whether the bells of Lyonesse ring beneath the water on still nights, as the most romantically inclined versions of the story insist, is something that the evidence does not support in a verifiable way. Whether the last survivor of the flood, a man named Trevelyan who rode his horse to safety as the waters rose, watching his world disappear behind him, is a historical individual distantly remembered, is impossible to say. What is certain is that the land was there, the sea took it. The people who were on it were displaced across generations by an event that was slow enough to be lived through, and catastrophic enough to be remembered. And the remembering is itself a kind of survival, for as long as anyone is still telling the story. The mystery of the Somerton man, this case is not British by origin, but it reached Britain, and what it left behind is in a British library, and the question it raises about the meaning of a man's life and death is one that has never been answered. On the 1st of December 1948, the body of a well-dressed man was found on Somerton Beach, near Adelaide, in Australia. He was about 40 years old, well-built, wearing good quality clothes. He had no identification, no wallet, no personal papers. The labels had been removed from his clothes. He had a small scrap of paper in a secret pocket sewn into the waistband of his trousers. The paper contained the words Tamshud, printed in small type. The words are Persian. They mean ended or finished. They are the last words of a poem in the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a collection of 12th century Persian verses that had been translated into English by Edward Fitzgerald in 1859 and had become extremely popular in the English-speaking world. A copy of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam was eventually found in the back of a car parked near the beach. The final page from which the words Tamshud had been cut was missing. On the inside back cover of the book, written in pencil, were 5 lines of letters that appeared to, with a code, or at least an enciphered message. ARO, Babed Emily, Our We Temps, Est Gabanet, Emily, Abu RQC. These letters have never been deciphered. Professional CRIP analysts, intelligence agencies, amateur code readers, and AI systems applied in more recent years have not produced a confirmed decryption. The message, if it is a message, has not been read. The book with the code had a telephone number penciled in it, and it was traced to a woman in Adelaide, a nurse named Jo Thompson, later identified as Jessica Thompson. She was interviewed by police. She said she did not know the dead man. She showed visible distress when shown photographs of his face. She gave police a name, Tibor Kaldor, as someone who might have possessed such a book, though this lead went nowhere significant. She subsequently refused all further contact with investigators and declined all interviews for the rest of her life. She died in 2007 without having explained her connection to the case. Why is this in a collection of British mysteries? Because one thread of the investigation leads to Britain, specifically to the history of British intelligence in the aftermath of the Second World War. The Somerton man, whoever he was, has been the subject of substantial speculation that he was a foreign intelligence agent, possibly Soviet, possibly American, operating in the early Cold War period. The Adelaide area in 1948 was connected to Australian weapons research at a nearby facility. The concealed note, the removed labels, the code, the destroyed identification, all of these are consistent with the practices of intelligence tradecraft. Agents were trained to carry no identification, to have labels removed from clothing, to prevent national origin being established, and to communicate in code. If the Somerton man was an intelligence operative, British intelligence services of the period would have had both the information to identify him and the reasons to suppress that identification. The Cold War intelligence community was deeply secretive about the existence and identity of its operatives, and the death of an agent in circumstances that might illuminate the trade, craft, or the operations being conducted would be exactly the kind of thing that would be covered. This is speculation. There is no direct evidence connecting the Somerton man to British intelligence. The British intelligence archives of the period remain largely classified or selectively released, and there is no public document that names this man or acknowledges his existence. In 2022, a DNA analysis conducted by researchers at the University of Adelaide produced a potential identification. The analysis suggested a possible match with a man named Carl Webb, an electrical engineer from Melbourne. Carl Webb was a real person who disappeared around the right time. The identification was made public and was treated as significant by Australian authorities. It has not been universally accepted by researchers who have followed the case closely, some of whom find the identification incomplete and not fully supported by the available evidence. Whether Carl Webb is the Somerton man, whether the code was personal or professional, whether Jessica Thompson knew him and in what capacity, whether the tam shud in his pocket was the last message of a spy, or the private statement of a man who had decided that his own story was finished. None of these questions have been answered with the certainty the case deserves. The code sits in the archives. The letters are there, legible, clear. They mean something, or they mean nothing. They are the last visible remnant of a mind that has been gone for more than 70 years. Tam should finished ended. Not quite, not yet. What lies beneath birth? The Romans came to Britain in 43 CE, and stayed for nearly 400 years. When they left behind roads and walls and the foundations of cities. And they left behind beneath the city that is now called Bath in Somerset, one of the most remarkable structures in Roman Britain. The Romans called it Aquilis, the waters of Sulis. Sulis was a local British goddess of the spring, and the Romans did what they often did with local deities in newly conquered provinces. They identified her with a Roman goddess, in this case Minerva, and built a temple complex that honored both simultaneously. The hot spring at Bath, which produces approximately 1 million L of water per day at a temperature of around 46 degrees Celsius, was extraordinary enough to justify a significant religious and civil investment. The spring had been sacred to the local British population before the Romans came. The Romans simply built on what was already there. Within the complex they built was a great bath, the main pool lined with lead sheets and fed directly from the spring. Around it were smaller pools, changing rooms, heated rooms, a colonnade. Over the spring itself was a temple with a gilded roof, inside which a fire burned continuously. The water from the spring, which is naturally rich in minerals and naturally warm, and which steams in the cold British air, was treated as the expression of divine presence. The structure was lost. After the Romans left, the maintenance that kept the lead drainage system working stopped, and over the following centuries, the great baths flooded and silted up and were buried under the accumulation of a city building itself on the same ground. Medieval Bath was built on top of Roman Bath without fully understanding what was beneath it. There were legends about the spring and the old buildings, references in early medieval Welsh poetry to a ruined city with wonderful hot baths, but the physical structure was gone from view. In 1727, workmen laying a sewer in Bath broke through the floor of a street and found a gilded bronze head. The head is a masterpiece of Roman craftsmanship, a female face about 3/4 life-size, with a serene and formal expression. It is almost certainly the cult image from the temple of Sulis Minerva, the face that worshippers would have approached with their offerings and their prayers. It had been underground for more than 1,000 years. It is now in the Roman Baths Museum. The major excavations of the Roman baths began in 1878 and continued through subsequent decades as the site was progressively uncovered. What the excavators found, in addition to the physical structure of the baths themselves, was an extraordinary collection of objects that had been thrown into the sacred spring as offerings over the 400 years of Roman occupation. Among the objects in the spring were approximately 12,000 Roman coins, spanning the entire period of occupation, a testament to the continuous use of the site over 4 centuries. There were also pewter and silver objects, jewelry, cups, small figurines, and there were the curse tablets. More than 130 lead curse tablets have been recovered from the spring at Bath. They are sheets of lead, inscribed with Latin text, folded or rolled, and thrown into the spring as offerings to Sulis Minerva. The texts are petitions to the goddess. Please punish the person who stole my bronze bowl. Please punish whoever took my gloves. Please afflict the person who robbed me, whether they are slave or free, man or woman, soldier or civilian. These texts are remarkable for what they reveal about the people who used the spring. They are not the expressions of the powerful and the educated alone. They are the petitions of ordinary people who have been wronged and who have no recourse except to a divine authority. Someone stole a cloak, someone stole a silver ring, someone was cheated in a business deal. The aggrieved person went to the spring, scratched their grievance into a sheet of lead, and threw it into the water as an appeal to a power greater than any magistrate. And there are mysteries in the tablets too. Some of them are written in a script that is not quite Latin, not quite anything else that has been identified. They appear to be attempts to write in an unknown or invented language, possibly a representation of speaking in tongues, possibly a deliberate obscuring of the petition so that only the goddess could read it. Several tablets have been found that are written in this unidentified script and have never been deciphered. Who threw those tablets into the spring? What were they asking for that they needed to hide, even from other worshippers? What loss were they petitioning the goddess to avenge? The spring still flows, the water still rises at the same temperature and the same rate it has risen for the entire recorded history of the site, and for the unrecorded history before that. The spring itself, the source of all of this, has been producing this hot mineral water since the last ice age, fed by rainfall that falls on the Menip Hills and percolates down through the limestone over a period of between 10 and 30 mer, before rising again, heated by the geothermal gradient. At the point where the Romans built their temple, the water that is flowing from that spring right now fell as rain in the Mandip Hills somewhere between 10 and 30 years ago. It has been underground since then, moving through limestone, being heated, rising. It has no knowledge of the Romans or the goddess or the cursed tablets. It is simply water doing what water does. And yet the continuity of it, the spring flowing now as it flowed when the gilded head was above it, and the fire burned and the offerings were thrown in, has its own strange quality. Some things persist past all the changes that accumulate around them. The peculiar case of the Bifford witches. In 1682, 3 women from Bedford in Devon were hanged for witchcraft. Their names were Temperance Lloyd, Mary Trembles, and Susanna Edwards. They were the last people to be legally executed for witchcraft in England. This is a fact that has been recorded and repeated many times. But what sits inside it, when you look at it carefully, is stranger and more troubling than the simple factual statement suggests. Because the execution of these 3 women in 1682 happened in a specific political and intellectual context, a context in which in many parts of the educated community in England, serious doubt about the reality of witchcraft as a prosecutable offence had already been developing for decades. The Witchcraft Act, under which Temperance Lloyd, Mary Trembles, and Susanna Edwards were prosecuted, was an old piece of legislation, but it had been modified and extended over the decades. The prosecution of witches in England had been declining since the mid-7th century, partly as a result of the Civil War and its aftermath, which had disrupted many traditional institutional processes, and partly as a result of a genuine shift in educated opinion towards skepticism about the supernatural mechanisms underlying witchcraft accusations. Thomas Hobbes, writing in the 1650s, had been deeply skeptical about the reality of witchcraft. John Webster, a clergyman who published a critique of witch trials in 1677, 5 years before the Bidford hangings, argued that the testimony on which convictions were based was unreliable, and that the physical evidence typically presented, the witches' marks, the familiars, the confessions extracted under duress, was either invented or misinterpreted. And yet in 1682 in Bidford, 3 women confessed. Temperance Lloyd confessed to having had sexual intercourse with the devil. She confessed to having killed a number of people through magical means. She named her accomplices. Mary Trembles and Susanna Edwards were arrested, and they too confessed. The confessions were taken seriously by the local magistrates, and the case went to trial at the Exit Assizes. The judge at the Exit of Sizes, Sir Francis North, was skeptical. He was concerned about the evidence and about the reliability of the confessions. He wrote after the trial, expressing his discomfort with the verdict and the outcome. But the jury convicted, and the sentence of death was carried out. What drove those confessions? The women were poor, elderly, and without social resources or protections. The process of examination in a witchcraft case involved sustained pressure, sleep deprivation, physical examination for witches' marks, and the repeated insistence of authority figures that confession was the appropriate and expected response. In this context, confession was sometimes a form of survival strategy, an attempt to give the examiners what they wanted in the hope of mercy, and sometimes a genuine expression of a belief system that included the real possibility of the kind of compact with the devil that was being described. Temperance Lloyd was described by contemporaries as a woman of confused and wandering mind, which in modern assessment might suggest dementia or some form of cognitive impairment. Whether she fully understood what she was confessing to is genuinely unclear. The city of Bifford erected a memorial to the three women in 2008 on the 3006th anniversary of their execution. The memorial acknowledges them as victims. It is located in Victoria Park, not far from the site where they were hanged. The accusers, the witnesses who gave evidence against them, the magistrates who sent the case forward, the jury that convicted, their names are in the historical record too. They were not monsters. They were people operating within a belief system and a legal framework that took witchcraft seriously. In a community experiencing the particular anxieties of a small Devon town in the 1680s, anxieties about illness and misfortune, and the causes of bad things happening to good people. The question of what those three old women actually believed about themselves, what Temperance Lloyd's confession meant to her in the moment she gave it, what the experience of those final days was like for women who had lived their whole lives in Bedford and who died on a gallows at the edge of it, is the question that the historical record does not answer. The memorial is there, the park is there, the town of Bidford is there, a working port town, the long bridge over the River Torridge, the quay where the fishing boats come in, the town that has been there since before the Norman conquest, and will be there long after the question of what happened to three old women in 1682 has ceased to matter to anyone. The last legal execution for witchcraft in England, the three names, Temperance, Mary, Susanna, the confessions that cannot be verified or disproved, the judge who was uncomfortable and did nothing, the jury that convicted. The question is not whether they were witches. The question is what happens to a community when it destroys the people it is most frightened of. That question has not dated. The voice from the ice. In May 1845, the Franklin expedition left England with two ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, 129 men, and the intention of finding the Northwest Passage, the route through the Arctic, waters north of Canada, that would connect to the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The expedition was led by Sir John Franklin, a veteran Arctic explorer who was 60 years old and eager to command one final significant journey. They were never seen again. The disappearance of the Franklin expedition became over the following decades one of the defining mysteries of the Victorian era and one of the great tragedies of British exploration. The search for the men, launched after no word had been received for 2 years, eventually involved dozens of expeditions, including the famous voyage organized by Lady Jane Franklin, Franklin's wife, who spent years and most of her personal fortune attempting to find her husband and his men. What was eventually established through those searches and through the physical evidence recovered from the Arctic was this: the two ships became icebound near King William Island in September 1846. They remained icebound for nearly 2 years. Franklin died in June 1847, though the cause of his death was not established. In April 1848, the surviving officers under the command of the expedition's second-in-command, Francis Crozier, abandoned the ships and began marching south across the ice toward the Canadian mainland. They did not make it. All 128 remaining men died in the Arctic. The evidence for what happened comes from several sources. The most direct is a single piece of paper found in a can on King William Island by a search expedition in 1859, 14 years after the expedition left England. The paper was a standard Royal Navy form, intended for recording a ship's position at sea. It had been used twice. A first note, written in April 1847, recorded that the ships were in good condition and that all was well. Around the margins of this note, a second note had been added later, in April 1848. The second note recorded that Franklin had died on the 11th of June 1847, that 9 officers and 15 men had died by that point, and that the survivors were abandoning the ships and heading south. The second note is significant for what it reveals about the state of mind of the men who wrote it. The information is clinical and military in form. There is no despair visible in the language. There is no expression of fear or of the understanding that they were almost certainly going to die. They were following naval protocol in documenting the situation, and the protocol was maintained even in the Arctic in April 1848, with 100 men marching toward a death that some of them must have understood was coming. The physical remains found over subsequent decades told a more complex story. There were skeletons scattered across the ice and the shore of King William Island, and along the route south, in positions that suggested people who had simply stopped and died where they stood. There were boats dragged on sledges, loaded with equipment that no rational calculation of survival priorities would have included. Silver cutlery, a writing desk, a copy of a novel. The men were dragging silver cutlery across the Arctic ice. Analysis of bones recovered from the Franklin sites has revealed evidence of scurvy, of malnutrition, of lead poisoning, and of something more disturbing. Some of the bones show cut marks consistent with butchery. The evidence of cannibalism among the last survivors of the Franklin expedition, which was hinted at by Inuit testimony collected by early search expeditions, was effectively confirmed by the forensic analysis of the human remains. In 2014, HMS Erebus was found on the seabed in the Canadian Arctic. In 2016, HMS Terror was found. Both ships are remarkably well preserved in the cold, oxygen-poor water. Expeditions have entered both ships and recovered artifacts and documented the interior conditions. The ships have not yet given up all their secrets. Some of the cabins have not been fully explored. There may be documents, journals, logbooks that survived in airtight containers, and that would tell more of the story. The Inuit people of the Canadian Arctic knew things about the Franklin expedition that European searchers were slow to accept and credit. Inuit testimony collected in the 1850s and 1860s described encounters with large groups of white men walking and starving and dying, described finding their abandoned camps and their dead, described the ships being seen in different locations over several years. This testimony was treated with skepticism by European authorities at the time, partly from racism, partly from the discomfort of what it implied about the fate of the men. Subsequent research has established that the Inuit testimony was accurate in most of its verifiable details, and that the picture it provides of the expedition's last months of men, in desperate circumstances, struggling south across the ice, is consistent with the physical evidence. Franklin's grave has never been found. If it is in the Arctic, it is somewhere on or near King William Island, perhaps marked by some surface feature that has not been connected to the expedition, perhaps not marked at all. The ships are down there in the cold water. The documents that might be inside them are waiting. The Arctic is slow to give back what it has taken. Sir John Franklin led 128 men into the ice. He was looking for a passage. The passage exists. It was formally navigated for the first time in 1906. 55 years after the last survivor of Franklin's expedition died. The route is now navigable more easily than it has ever been, because the ice is retreating, because the world is warmer than it was. The warming that is opening the Northwest Passage is also uncovering the sites where the Franklin men died. The permafrost that preserved some of the remains is thawing. Objects that have been frozen in the Arctic for 180 years are being exposed. The ice is giving things back. Not everything, not yet. But it is speaking slowly in the language of what has been kept, and what is being released, and what it will keep forever. The darkness under London. Beneath the streets of London, beneath the underground railway lines and the Victorian sewers, and the buried rivers that still flow in their culverts under the city, there are things that most Londoners never think about. The buried rivers first. The Fleet, which gives its name to Fleet Street, flows from its source in Hampstead, through underground culverts all the way to the Thames, where it discharges near Blackfriars Bridge. You can hear it in certain places gurgling under gratings in the street. The Walbrook, which gave the Romans access to fresh water for their city, flows under the Mansion House and the Bank of England. The Tyburn, which ran through what is now Marylebone and Mayfair, is gone from view, but still present in the ground. The Ephra, whose name is possibly British, possibly Latin, runs from Norwood through Brixton to the Thames at Vauxhall. Completely invisible, but real. These buried rivers have created problems throughout London's history. They shift the ground. They flood unexpectedly when the rainfall is heavy. They create the damp conditions that accelerate the deterioration of foundations. Buildings have sunk into them. Basements have flooded with water that appeared from nowhere obvious. The city is underlain by a hydrology that is mostly invisible and not fully understood. Then there are the tunnels. London has more tunnels than any other city in the world, probably, or at least than any comparable city. The obvious ones are the underground railway system, which began construction in 1860 and expanded to become the largest metro network in the world by some measures. But beside and beneath the official network, there are others. During the Second World War, deep-level shelter tunnels were dug at various points under London to protect civilians from bombing. These tunnels are separate from the underground stations, which were used as shelters, but which were not purpose-built for that role. Several of the deep shelters were converted to other uses after the war. Some are still in use. Others are sealed, accessible only through hatches in unlikely locations. Their contents and their conditions unknown to most people. The Kingsway Telephone Exchange, a massive underground facility built in the 1950s for government communications in the event of nuclear war, is one of the better documented underground facilities. It ran for several blocks under Holborn, several stories underground, and contained all the infrastructure necessary to maintain government communications through a nuclear attack. It was decommissioned in 1992 and has been partially explored by urban explorers who have documented its abandoned corridors and equipment. Less well documented are the various tunnels and rooms that have been discovered accidentally during construction projects whose origins and purposes are not fully understood. A Victorian tunnel found under the Strand in the 1980s that led nowhere anyone could determine. A sealed chamber under a Sodok building site that contained nothing except what appeared to be a sealed door leading further down, which was covered over and built upon a system of passages under Cheapside that may be connected to a medieval religious house that occupied the site. Or maybe something else entirely. London has been built and rebuilt so many times, over so many centuries, by so many different peoples for so many different purposes, that its underground is genuinely and deeply layered, ways that no single survey has fully captured. The Londinium of the Romans is 2 to 4 meters below the current surface level. Its streets and buildings, replaced by the accumulated debris of 17 subsequent centuries of occupation. Below that are the remnants of even earlier habitation, Bronze Age and Iron Age settlement, on what was then the north bank of a much wider Thames. To walk down a street in central London is to walk above an enormous amount of history, and above an enormous amount of darkness, and above things that were built for purposes that are no longer operative and have not been thought about in a very long time. The darkness under London is old. It is layered. It holds the bones of plague victims, and the treasures of merchants, and the foundations of buildings that were being built when the Norman kings were new. And it holds the secrets of the buried rivers, and the forgotten tunnels, and the sealed chambers, and the unopened doors. Every year, construction projects break through walls or floors and find something unexpected. Every year the underground reveals something, and every year the bulk of what is down there, the incomprehensible accumulated weight of 17 centuries of city, continues to stay exactly where it is, waiting in the dark as it has always waited. Glastonbury, and the question of Arthur. There is a place in Somerset where the flat levels of the Somerset levels give way to a sudden upthrust of hill, to rising sharply from the surrounding plain, and where on that hill the ruins of a medieval church tower stand against the sky. The place is Glastonbury. The hill is Glastonbury Tor, and the question that clings to this place like the mist that clings to the levels below it on cold mornings is one of the oldest questions in British history. Was King Arthur real? The question is unanswerable, and that is both its problem and its power. The traditions that connect Arthur to Glastonbury are numerous, and have accumulated over more than 1,000 years. The earliest are found in Welsh texts that associate the legendary king with a place called Avalon, the island of apples, the mystical place where Arthur was taken after his last battle to be healed of his wounds. Glastonbury, surrounded in earlier centuries by the floodplains of the Somerset levels, would have appeared as an island, or near island, in a landscape of water and marsh, and the connection between the isle-like quality of Glastonbury and the mythological Isle of Avalon was made early in the literary tradition. In 1191, the monks of Glastonbury Abbey announced a remarkable discovery. They had been digging in the abbey's cemetery and had found at a considerable depth a coffin made from a hollowed oak log. Above the coffin, they said, was a leaden cross with an inscription identifying the burial as that of the famous King Arthur, buried here in the Isle of Avalon, with his second wife, the famous Guyanere. The discovery was received with enormous interest across Europe. The lean cross was examined by multiple witnesses over the following centuries, including the Antichrist John Leland in the 16th century, who transcribed the inscription, "This has since been lost, and no one has been able to trace what happened to it." The bones that were claimed to have been in the coffin were eventually rearied in a black marble tomb in the Abbey Church in a ceremony attended by King Edward II and Queen Eleanor in 1278. That tomb was destroyed during the dissolution of the monasteries in the 16th century, and the bones, whatever they were, are gone. The 1191 discovery is almost universally regarded by modern scholars as a fabrication conducted by the Abbey for specific, practical reasons. Glastonbury Abbey had suffered a devastating fire in 1184 that destroyed much of its structure, and the Abbey was in serious financial difficulty. The discovery of Arthur's grave, with its implications that Arthur was genuinely dead and was not returning, as the old tradition said he would, to save Britain in its hour of need, would have attracted pilgrims, donations, and royal patronage, which it did. The discovery was extremely convenient, but the fabrication of the 1191 grave does not resolve the question of Arthur. It only demonstrates that medieval monks were willing to capitalize on the legend. The legend predates the fabrication by several centuries. The earliest texts that mention Arthur, the historian attributed to a writer called Nennius, and dating to around 830 CE. The Welsh poem Y Godan, which may predate it. The references in various Welsh annals all describe Arthur as a historical leader who fought a series of battles against the Saxon invaders of Britain in the late 5th and early 6th centuries. He is described not as a king, but as a battle leader, a war chief, the Dux Bellorum, who fought alongside the British kings. He is credited with a decisive victory at a battle called Mons Badonicus, Mount Ben, which is also mentioned in the writings of the monk Gildas, though Gildas does not name Arthur. The historical question is whether there was a real person, a real British leader of the post-Roman period, around whose memory and achievements the elaborate Arthurian legend eventually grew. Most historians who work on the period accept that there probably was some historical core, some real figure or figures of the late 5th century, whose military successes against the Saxon advance were remembered and celebrated in oral tradition and eventually attached to the name Arthur. What they reject is the medieval elaboration, the Round Table, the Grail Quest, Camelot, Guyanere, Lancelot, Merlin. These are literary additions of the 12th and 13th centuries, the creative work of Geoffrey of Muth and Trian Dato, and the anonymous authors of the Arthurian cycle. Whether the historical kernel is recoverable is another question. The archaeology of the late 5th and early 6th century in Britain is one of the most difficult periods to work with, because the documentary record collapsed with the end of Roman time. Administration and the material culture changed in ways that are hard to date precisely. The period is sometimes called the Dark Ages, not because nothing was happening, but because the light of documentation went out for a time, and what we can see is limited and ambiguous. There are places that have been associated with Arthur by various traditions. South Cadbury in Somerset, which was a major Iron Age and post-Roman hill fort that some archaeologists believe may be the historical Camelot, or at least one of its models. Tintagel in Cornwall, where a significant and mysterious post-Roman settlement has been excavated. Bamber in Northland, the great fortress on the Northumbrian coast that has its own claim on the tradition. None of them has produced an inscription, a document, a datable artifact that names Arthur. None of them has provided the physical evidence that would settle the question in the way that historians and archaeologists would like it to be settled. Glastonbury Tor is still there. On clear days it can be seen from a very great distance across the Somerset levels. On misty days, it appears to float above the surrounding landscape as the island it once nearly was. The abbey ruins below are still being excavated slowly, carefully, by archaeologists who understand that there may be more in the ground than has yet been found. Whatever is there, whatever is not there, the question remains exactly as it has always been. Was there a man called Arthur? Did he ride out from a hill like this one in the grey light of the early 6th century to fight the enemies of a Britain that was trying to hold itself together after Rome let go? Did he win a battle that mattered at Ben, or somewhere else that bought Britain another Rome, generation before the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms became permanent? We do not know. We may never know. But the hill is there in the mist, and the story is there, and the 1200 years of literature and legend that grew from a kernel of something real or imagined, all of it pressing back toward a figure who may or may not have ever existed, are there, and that is perhaps enough. The mystery of Richard III's grave. In September 2012, archaeologists excavating a car park in Leicester made one of the most extraordinary discoveries in the history of British archaeology. Beneath the tarmac and the soil, beneath what had once been the choir of the Grey Friars Church, they found a skeleton. The skeleton was of a man who had died young, somewhere between his late 20s and his late 30s. His skeleton showed evidence of severe scoliosis, a lateral curvature of the spine that would have given him a noticeably uneven posture, one shoulder higher than the other. He had been killed by multiple blows, several of which were inflicted after he was dead, blows to a man who was already down. The skeleton had been hastily buried without a coffin, slightly too large for the grave that had been dug for it, so that the head was positioned at an angle against the wall. The DNA analysis that followed, comparing the mitochondrial DNA extracted from the skeleton's teeth with that of living descendants of Richard III's sister, confirmed what the historical and physical evidence suggested. This was Richard III, King of England, killed at the Battle of Bosworth on the 22nd of August 1485, buried hurriedly in the Grey Friars Church, and then forgotten for 427 years, under the accumulation of subsequent history. He was Eerie Cathedral in 2015, with full royal ceremony attended by dignitaries and thousands of ordinary people who came to mark the occasion. The reinterment was watched by millions on television. The discovery and the reinterment generated the obvious question: if Richard III had been lying under a car park for 5 centuries, what else is beneath the surface of Leicester and of every other British city waiting to be found? But it also generated a less comfortable question that had been present in the background throughout the investigation. The physical evidence confirmed something that the historical record had described. The scoliosis was real, though far less dramatic than Shakespeare's Hunchback had suggested. The manner of his death, the post-mortem blows to a fallen man, the inadequate burial, was consistent with what a defeated enemy might receive from victorious soldiers who did not respect him. The historical question of who Richard really was, and what he was responsible for, was not answered by the skeleton. The bones tell you how he died. They do not tell you what he did. The Ricardians, who had been campaigning for his rehabilitation for decades, celebrated the discovery and the rearial. The historians, who take a more mixed view of Richard's character and actions, noted that the rearial was being conducted with a degree of ceremony and sympathy that the contemporary evidence perhaps did not fully support. The skeleton under the car park is in a way the most perfectly British discovery of the modern era. A king, a car park, 5 centuries DNA, and a question that the DNA cannot answer. Was the man inside that skeleton guilty of what history accused him of? And did he die deserving the post-mortem blows his enemies gave him? Or did he die as something more complicated, a man who took a throne in difficult circumstances and governed for 2 years before a usurper came from over the sea and killed him on a field in Leicester? The bones do not say. They never do. The grave is in the cathedral now, properly marked, properly attended. The car park is still a car park. History has reclaimed its own and left the question exactly as it found it, unanswered and deeply, specifically human. The end of the mysteries. We have come a long way tonight. From the Tower of London to the Arctic ice. From a Suffolk garden to the sea floor of the Cornish coast. From a police house in Enfield to the peat bogs of Cheshire. From a car park in Leicester to the bones of a king. From the 12th century to last century. From the definitely true to the possibly legendary to the genuinely unknown. Along the way, certain themes have emerged that run through all of these cases, regardless of their century or their nature. One of them is power. So many of Britain's darkest mysteries involve people who had power over others and used it in ways that could not be fully accounted for. The princes in the tower were killed, if they were killed, by someone with the power to arrange it and suppress the evidence. The Pendle women were convicted by a system that had the power to do so and no effective check on that power. Amy Robsart died in a household that belonged to one of the most powerful men in England. Hilda Merrill was murdered, and the investigation that followed was conducted by institutions that had interest of their own. Power distorts the record. It decides what is preserved and what is destroyed, what is investigated, and what is quietly filed away. Another theme is the landscape itself. Britain's landscape is not neutral. It is old enough to carry things that have been placed in it deliberately, the bog bodies, the witch bottles, the carved marks, and things that have been placed in it accidentally, the crashed aircraft, the abandoned churches, the submerged forests. It holds things with varying enthusiasm and releases them on its own schedule. The ice returns the Franklin dead. The peat gives back faces. The seafloor yields ships. The car park produces kings. The landscape is always doing something with what has been put into it, and what it gives back is never quite what was buried. A third theme is witness. Almost every mystery in this collection rests at some level on the testimony of people who were there. The soldiers who saw the lights over Rendlesham Forest. The Inuit who found the Franklin survivors. The New Zealand soldiers on the ridge above Gallipoli. The policemen who watched the chair move in Enfield. The people of Woolpit who gathered around a pit and found 2 green children. Witnesses who in their own time, and by their own standards, had no reason to lie. Whose accounts were written down or recorded or passed on, and whose testimony we are still sitting with centuries later. The fourth theme is the gap. Every mystery described tonight has a gap in it, a place where the evidence stops and something happened that was not recorded or cannot be recovered. Sometimes the gap is small, a missing document, a body not found, a question that was never asked. Sometimes the gap is enormous, an entire life before a dead man on a beach. The last months of 100 men in Arctic ice, the decision made in a room that was never written down. The gaps are the places where the mystery lives. They are where our imagination goes when the evidence runs out. And they are in a way the most honest parts of the story. The acknowledgement that we were not there, that we cannot know, that the past does not give a complete account of itself. Britain is not the largest country in the world. It is not the most geographically varied or the most culturally diverse in the way that continents are diverse. What it is and what it has been for longer than almost anywhere that maintains a continuous, written record is inhabited, attended to, argued over, described, surveyed, and loved. Every square mile of it has been walked by people who noticed things. Every century of it has produced writers and investigators and chroniclers and ordinary people who told their neighbors what they saw. And still the mysteries remain. That is the lesson, if there is one. Not that the dark is impenetrable, but that darkness persists even in places where light has been brought again and again. The princes in the tower have not emerged from the historical shadow, despite 500 years of effort. Jack the Ripper's identity has not been established, despite more forensic attention than almost any other Victorian crime. The Flannan Isles gave the sea their keepers and kept the reason why. The moors of Lancashire hold what they hold. The bog gave back a face and kept the name. Britain has been asking itself questions for 2,000 years of recorded history. And for much longer, in the unrecorded time before that, some of the questions get answered. Some of them do not. The ones that do not are the ones we are drawn to across centuries, across disciplines, across the gap between what we want to know and what the evidence allows. They are the ones we are drawn to in the small hours when the ordinary explanations of the day have quieted and the imagination has room to move. So here you are, at the end of a long night, in Britain's darker corridors. The mist is still there, out over the moors. The water is still rising from the spring at birth. The light over Rendlesham Forest has long since gone out. The bridge near Dumbarton waits for morning. The ice in the Arctic holds its dead, and the mystery of it, which is not the mystery of answers withheld, but the mystery of reality, being genuinely stranger than we account for, that persists. It is enough tonight simply to have sat with it. Close your eyes now. Britain will still be here in the morning, with all its questions, and some of them you now understand. It has been holding for a very long time. If this is the kind of journey you like taking, there is much more here. The history is deep, and the questions are endless, and the nights are long enough to hold them. Leave a comment below, telling me which mystery you find most compelling, which story you will still be thinking about when you wake up. I read every one of them. The comment I'm always most interested in is the simple one. What brought you here? What is it about the unresolved, the dark, the historical question, without a clean answer that keeps bringing you back? Because there is something in that attraction that I find worth thinking about. We live in a world that offers instant answers for almost everything. The accumulated knowledge of recorded human history is accessible from a device in most magnets to us. And yet the mysteries remain magnetic. The gaps remain compelling. The questions that cannot be answered draw more attention, more passion, and more sustained interest than the questions that can. I think it is because the unresolved mysteries are the places where history is still alive, where the past is not yet finished, where something is still happening, still being worked out, still unresolved in the particular way that living things are unresolved, rather than the clean, resolved way that dead things are. The missing child on the moor, the king under the car park, the lighthouse where the logbook was still being written when the men disappeared. These are places where time has not fully closed. If you are not yet part of this community, consider staying. We do this kind of thing here. Sleep well, wherever you are, in whatever corner of the world you have carried these stories to tonight. The dark outside your window is the same dark it has always been, and it holds the same things it has always held.